I am Gabrielle, 35 years old, and the director of wealth management at a top firm in Atlanta. I had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal over lunch. But when I returned to the 40th floor executive suite, I found my entire top-performing team standing in the hallway holding cardboard boxes. My boss, Roland, stepped out of my corner office with a smug grin, announcing that his newly hired brother-in-law needed my premium space to impress his network, and my team was being relocated to the windowless sub-basement next to the freight elevators. I did not scream or argue. I just looked at my devastated team, smiled a terrifyingly calm smile, and said, "Do not unpack in the basement. Pack your bags for good." Roland had no idea what was coming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic boss who underestimated your worth. The afternoon started with the kind of triumphant high that only comes from years of relentless dedication. I had just stepped out of an upscale steakhouse in Buckhead, the Georgia sun warming my face as I waited for the valet to bring my car around. For the past 2 hours, I had masterfully navigated a high-stakes negotiation with one of the most elusive real estate developers in the state. When he finally signed the portfolio transfer paperwork, securing another massive win for my division, I felt invincible. As an African-American woman in the notoriously cutthroat world of wealth management, I had never been handed anything. I had fought tooth and nail for every single promotion, every client relationship, and every square foot of office space I commanded. I was 35 years old, and I had built an absolute powerhouse of a team. The drive back to our downtown corporate headquarters was a blur of satisfaction. I was mentally drafting the congratulatory email I was going to send to my core staff. I stepped onto the polished chrome elevator, watching the digital floor indicator climb rapidly to the 40th floor. The high-speed doors slid shut behind me with a soft whisper as I stepped out into the executive suite. The afternoon light was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, casting a golden hue over the skyline of downtown Atlanta. I expected to walk into my division and hear the familiar energizing hum of my team, hard at work closing trades and managing accounts. Instead, I walked into a scene that made the breath catch in my throat. The expansive glass-walled suite that housed my division was completely silent. The ergonomic chairs were empty. The dual monitor setups were powered down and disconnected. And standing in the main marble hallway clustered together like an afterthought was my entire core team. Jamal, my brilliant portfolio strategist who could spot market trends weeks before the algorithms caught on. Kiara, my senior analyst, whose financial models had practically doubled our division's revenue over the last 3 years. And Andre, the sharpest client relations manager the firm had ever seen. They were all holding cheap brown cardboard boxes. Their personal belongings framed family photos, expensive coffee mugs, and hard-earned achievement plaques were haphazardly shoved inside those pathetic boxes. The silence in the hallway was deafening. The sheer disrespect hanging in the air was so thick I could practically taste it. Jamal caught my eye first. His posture was rigid, his broad shoulders tense, and his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. Kiara looked like she was fighting back tears of absolute humiliation, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edges of her moving box. Andre simply stared at the floor, shaking his head in silent, exhausted defeat. This was my hand-picked team. These were the brilliant young financial minds I had mentored, protected, and fought for. Together, we managed over $800 million in assets. We were the undisputed highest-earning division in the entire building. And right now they were standing in the corridor like they had just been fired by a negligent security guard. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as I closed the distance between us, the sound echoing in the unnatural quiet. My mind raced through a dozen different disaster scenarios. Had there been an unannounced corporate restructuring while I was at lunch? Had compliance flagged a major non-existent violation? But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of what was actually happening. Before I could even open my mouth to ask Jamal what was going on, the heavy oak door of my corner office swung open. Out strolled Roland. Roland was our newly appointed regional vice president. He was an African-American man in his 50s who cared far more about securing tea times at his exclusive country club than he did about actual financial performance or leadership. He straightened the cuffs of his tailored suit and offered me a smile so deeply smug and unapologetic that it made my blood run cold. Following closely behind him like an overeager puppy was Trent. Trent was 30-something white, chronically underqualified, and conveniently married to Roland's younger sister. He had been shoehorned into our division a few months prior as a senior vice president of strategy, a fabricated title that meant absolutely nothing. Despite having failed his licensing exams twice, he strutted around the office acting like he owned the place. I had spent countless billable hours over the past quarter, forcing my highly skilled team to clean up Trent's elementary accounting errors, all while Roland paraded him around board meetings as the firm's new disruptive visionary. "Welcome back, Gabrielle," Roland said, his voice dripping with forced, overly loud corporate cheerfulness. "I hope your lunch was productive. As you can see, we are making some exciting organizational shifts this afternoon." I looked from Roland to my team, then back to my corner office. Inside, Trent was already setting down his overpriced leather briefcase on my custom mahogany desk, running his hand over the leather of my executive chair. "What exactly is going on here, Roland?" I asked, keeping my tone completely flat and measured. I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. Roland chuckled, a condescending sound that echoed in the quiet hallway. "Well, Trent here is bringing in some very high net worth prospects over the next few weeks. He needs premium optical space to host his meetings and impress his network. We cannot have our star strategy executive working out of a cubicle, can we? So I have authorized a permanent workspace reassignment. He needs the corner office. Gabrielle and his new support staff will take over your team's desks." I stared at him, letting his absurd, nepotistic justification hang in the air. "You are giving my office and my division's floor space to Trent," I stated, stripping all emotion from my voice, analyzing the sheer stupidity of his tactical move. "And where exactly is my team supposed to work?" Roland waved his hand dismissively toward the back elevators. "We have secured a fantastic collaborative space for your group in the lower level. It is quiet, perfect for crunching numbers." The lower level. He meant the sub-basement. A windowless, damp concrete bunker situated right next to the noisy freight elevators and the building's maintenance supply closets. He was taking the team that generated the highest revenue in the region, the team responsible for keeping this entire branch afloat, and shoving us underground so his incompetent brother-in-law could play pretend executive in the sunlight. The sheer audacity of the disrespect was almost blinding. It was not just poor management. It was an insult to our dignity, our hard work, and our worth as professionals. I looked at Kiara, who swallowed hard, her eyes pleading with me to fix this injustice. I looked at Jamal, who looked completely ready to drop his box and walk out the front door forever, throwing away years of career building out of pure disgust. I felt a surge of white-hot rage building in my chest, a fierce protective instinct over the people who had trusted me with their livelihoods. Any other director might have screamed. They might have stormed down to human resources, threatened massive discrimination lawsuits, or thrown a dramatic tantrum right there in the marble hallway. But I am not any other director. I operate on cold, calculated logic. I knew that losing my temper would only give Roland exactly what he wanted, an excuse to label me as an aggressive, difficult employee and justify his blatant favoritism. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger crystallize into pure, focused strategy. I saw the entire chessboard in my mind, and I knew exactly how many moves it would take to put him in checkmate. I turned my back on Roland and Trent, entirely giving them the ultimate dismissal, and faced my team. "Do not bother taking those boxes down to the freight elevator," I said, my voice incredibly calm but carrying a heavy, undeniable weight that made Jamal, Kiara, and Andre stand up straighter. I smiled, a terrifyingly serene expression that I knew would haunt Roland for the rest of his miserable career. "Do not unpack in the basement. Pack your bags for good." Roland let out a short, dismissive bark of laughter behind me. He actually thought I was being theatrical. He thought I was throwing a tantrum that would blow over by Monday morning when reality set in. I did not turn around to correct him or give him the satisfaction of a second glance. I simply pressed the call button for the elevator. My team hesitated for a fraction of a second, their eyes darting between Roland's smug face and my unwavering posture, before they stepped forward and joined me. The heavy metal doors slid shut, cutting off Roland's arrogant expression and sealing the four of us inside the descending quiet of the elevator car. The physical descent felt symbolic, but not in the way Roland intended. As I watched the digital floor numbers tick downward, I looked at Jamal, Kiara, and Andre. They were still clutching their cardboard boxes, their faces a complex mix of shock, humiliation, and residual anger. Looking at them, the reality of what we had built over the last 8 years washed over me. When I first walked into this firm at 27 years old, I was given a desk near the restrooms and a spreadsheet of dead leads. The wealth management industry is notoriously exclusionary. It is a gated community built on legacy connections and generational privilege. As a young African-American woman, I was certainly not handed a key to the gate. I had to build my own door and then kick it off its hinges. I spent my first 3 years cold calling until my throat was raw. I attended endless networking events where I was consistently the only Black woman in the room. I learned to smile through the subtle condescension, the assumption that I was the assistant, and the visible surprise when I eloquently dismantled their outdated investment strategies. I took the clients nobody else wanted to manage, the complicated trusts, the demanding entrepreneurs, the volatile accounts that required actual grueling work instead of just passive maintenance. I turned those forgotten accounts into thriving multi-million-dollar portfolios. Slowly but surely, our performance numbers became impossible for upper management to ignore. Today, my division manages over $800 million in assets. We are not just hitting our quarterly targets. We are single-handedly funding the operational overhead for this entire regional branch. I did not build this empire alone. When my revenue numbers finally forced the executives to give me hiring authority, I refused to recruit from the usual country club networks or legacy fraternities. I was not looking for polished resumes with no substance. I was looking for hunger. I wanted the sheer brilliance that the corporate establishment routinely overlooked. I found Jamal in a junior analyst pool being ignored because his suits were not custom-tailored and he did not spend his weekends playing golf with the partners. But Jamal was a mathematical prodigy from Southwest Atlanta who could read market volatility like a musician reads sheet music. I brought him onto my team, and within a year his trend forecasting was outperforming the firm's highly paid algorithm models. Kiara had 2 master's degrees in finance and economics coupled with a relentless, terrifying drive. Yet she was stuck doing glorified administrative work for a senior partner who routinely took credit for her financial models. I pulled her into my division and gave her the runway she deserved. She built predictive risk algorithms that our competitors actively tried to poach. She was sharp, fearless, and completely loyal. Then there was Andre. Andre possessed the kind of rare emotional intelligence that you simply cannot teach in a business school. He knew exactly how to talk to people. He could make a nervous tech millionaire or a wary old money matriarch feel completely secure in times of severe economic panic. He built an impenetrable wall of trust with our clients, and in wealth management, trust is the only currency that actually matters. Together, we became an absolute juggernaut. We arrived at the office before the sun came up, and we left long after the cleaning crews had emptied the trash bins. We shared late-night takeout over spread-out prospectuses, celebrated our massive wins with quiet nods across the conference table, and outworked, outsmarted, and outperformed every other division on that 40th floor. We were a family forged in the fire of a corporate environment that constantly demanded we prove we belonged there. We understood the unspoken rule. We had to be twice as good just to be considered equal, so we made the collective decision to be 10 times as good and render the rest of them completely irrelevant. We had built an $800 million fortress of wealth and trust, and now Roland believed he could just sweep us into a dark, damp basement to make room for his mediocre, unqualified brother-in-law. Roland operated under the dangerous delusion that those client accounts belonged to the corporate logo plastered on the front of the building. He fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of this industry. High net worth individuals do not park their generational wealth with a corporate logo. They park their money with the people who aggressively protect it. They park their money with me. As the elevator finally jolted to a stop at the sub-basement level, the doors opened to reveal a flickering fluorescent light and the smell of old, damp carpet. My team stepped out hesitantly, the heavy reality of the insult pressing down on their shoulders. They looked at me, waiting for the anger to crack my composure. They were waiting for me to tell them we were going to fight human resources or file a massive corporate complaint. I stepped into the dim concrete hallway, my designer heels echoing sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. I did not feel defeated. Looking at the dismal space Roland had assigned us, I felt an intense clarifying surge of power. Roland thought he was burying us. He had no idea he had just handed me the exact cover of darkness I needed to execute the most devastating financial coup this firm had ever seen. To understand how we ended up standing on stained linoleum next to a rattling freight elevator, you have to understand the specific brand of corporate parasite that Roland represents. He had been appointed as our regional vice president exactly 6 months ago, brought in during a broader corporate restructuring that prioritized administrative compliance over actual market innovation. Roland was a man in his late 50s who had built his entire career not on generating wealth, but on managing perception. He was an African-American executive who had spent 3 decades meticulously assimilating into the most rigid traditional corners of the old boys club. For Roland, the true measure of a financial advisor was never found in the percentage yield of their portfolios or the accuracy of their risk assessment models. His metrics of success were entirely cosmetic. He measured worth by the thread count of your bespoke suits, the prestige of your golf handicap, and your ability to seamlessly laugh at the stale jokes of aging old money billionaires at the local country club. He was a master of the firm handshake, the strategic backslap, and the hollow buzzword. He wore suits that cost more than a junior analyst's quarterly bonus, complete with monogrammed cuffs and perfectly folded pocket squares. His office always smelled of expensive cologne and old leather, carefully curated to project an image of old-school wealth. He could spend an hour talking about corporate synergy, brand elevation, and holistic wealth ecosystems without ever actually saying anything of substance. My division, on the other hand, was the absolute antithesis of everything Roland valued. We did not care about the country club because we did not need to play golf to secure capital. Our returns spoke for themselves. When clients saw the explosive, consistent growth we were generating, they did not care if we skipped the weekend charity galas. They cared that Jamal had correctly insulated their tech holdings before a sector crash, or that Kiara had optimized their tax liabilities to save them millions. We operated on raw data, relentless execution, and undeniable results. That fundamental difference made Roland immediately and intensely uncomfortable. During his first quarterly review with my division, I watched him actively glaze over when I brought up alternative asset classes and algorithmic risk hedging. He quickly interrupted me, asking how many of my top-tier clients I had taken to the company luxury box at the stadium. When I told him I preferred to secure their trust through consistent high annualized returns rather than catering to them with expensive shrimp cocktail, his jaw visibly tightened. From the very first week he took over the corner office on the executive floor, I could see the resentment brewing behind his perfectly veneered smile. He was a man who needed to feel essential, who required his subordinates to constantly seek his approval and stroke his ego. But my team did not need his approval, and we certainly did not need his guidance. We were a self-sustaining ecosystem. We generated our own leads, closed our own deals, and managed our own crises long before they ever reached his desk. In the corporate world, there is nothing more terrifying to an incompetent manager than a highly competent subordinate who operates with complete autonomy. Roland realized very quickly that he could not understand the complex predictive algorithms Kiara was building, nor could he keep up with the rapid-fire market analyses Jamal presented during our weekly briefings. Because he could not comprehend our work, he could not control it. And because he could not control it, he viewed it as a direct threat to his authority. He began deploying a series of escalating microaggressions designed to chip away at my autonomy and bring my division to heel. First, he instituted mandatory early morning alignment meetings. These were agonizing hour-long sessions where he required all directors to sit around a massive mahogany table while he lectured us on corporate culture. It was a blatant attempt to disrupt my team's actual productivity. While the global markets were opening and my analysts needed to be executing trades, I was forced to sit and listen to Roland recount a story about a birdie he shot on the 16th hole with a prospective client. When the alignment meetings failed to break my stride, he shifted to demanding excessive granular reporting. He requested daily breakdowns of every client interaction, every minor portfolio adjustment, and every internal email my team sent. It was classic administrative warfare. He wanted to drown us in so much red tape that our actual performance would suffer, giving him the excuse he needed to intervene and play the savior. But I refused to let him touch my team. I absorbed every single one of his bureaucratic attacks. I stayed at the office until midnight, filling out his pointless spreadsheets so Jamal and Kiara could focus on the actual market. I became an impenetrable shield between Roland's fragile ego and my team's brilliance. When he tried to call Andre into his office to question him about a client retention strategy, I intercepted. The meeting walked into Roland's office myself and dropped a bound. 50-page analytics report on his desk that proved our retention rate was 20% higher than the regional average. I answered every single one of his manufactured concerns with cold, hard, indisputable data. Every time I politely and professionally dismantled his critiques, the resentment in his eyes grew darker. I was not playing the game the way he demanded it be played. I was not deferring to his seniority. I was not asking for his mentorship. I was simply outperforming him in every measurable metric and doing it with a team of brilliant young Black professionals who did not fit into his outdated country club aesthetic. Roland needed to put me in my place. He needed to prove to the entire 40th floor that he was the undisputed king of the region and that my self-made autonomy was a privilege he could revoke at any moment. He realized he could not beat me on performance, and he could not beat me on data. If he was going to break my division, he had to change the rules of the game entirely. He had to introduce a variable I could not control through sheer hard work. He needed a proxy. He needed someone he could install directly into my ecosystem, someone whose very presence would undermine my authority and disrupt the airtight dynamic I had built with my team. That was the exact moment the corporate threat transitioned from a petty administrative annoyance to a full-blown hostile takeover of my life's work. The proxy arrived on a Tuesday morning. Roland called a mandatory division-wide assembly in the main conference room to unveil his newest executive hire. We were told this new addition was brought in to elevate our operational synergy and modernize our client acquisition pipeline. The reality walked through the double-glass doors 5 minutes late, holding an iced artisanal coffee and wearing a suit that was visibly expensive but tailored entirely wrong for his frame. This was Trent. He was a white man in his early 30s with the kind of unearned, relaxed confidence that only comes from a lifetime of failing upward. Roland stood at the head of the mahogany table beaming with pride and introduced him as our new Senior Vice President of Strategy. The title alone was a glaring red flag. In wealth management, titles like that are specifically fabricated for people who lack the regulatory credentials to actually handle money. I immediately did what any competent director would do. The moment the meeting concluded, I went back to my desk and ran a background check on his financial industry regulatory authority records. The results were exactly as pathetic as I anticipated. Trent had zero background in institutional wealth management. He had spent the last 5 years bouncing between vague consulting roles at marketing startups. More importantly, his testing history showed he had failed his Series 7 exam twice. He was not legally licensed to buy or sell a single share of stock, yet Roland had just installed him as a senior vice president in the highest-grossing division of the firm. The missing piece of the puzzle fell into place by the end of the day, when Andre, who always had his ear to the ground, walked into my office and quietly closed the door. Trent was married to Roland's younger sister, It was nepotism in its purest, most shameless form. Roland had bypassed human resources, ignored the strict corporate hiring freezes, and embedded his unqualified brother-in-law directly into my ecosystem. Trent's presence was an immediate and suffocating burden. He was given an office right next to mine, and he treated the entire 40th floor like his personal fraternity house. But the real danger was not his arrogant demeanor. It was his absolute staggering incompetence. Because his fabricated title included the word strategy, Roland decreed that Trent needed to review and approve our division's quarterly portfolio projections before they went out to our high-net-worth clients. It took exactly 3 days for Trent to cause a crisis. Kiara had spent an entire week building a highly sophisticated tax loss harvesting model for a prominent real estate developer. It was a flawless piece of financial architecture. She submitted the brief to Trent for his mandatory review. When Trent returned the file, he had completely altered the asset allocation ratios. He had confused dividend yield with total return, miscalculated the capital gains exposure, and adjusted the risk parameters so severely that the portfolio would have triggered a massive tax penalty for the client. Trent had essentially taken a scalpel to a masterpiece and replaced it with a crayon drawing. He sent the altered report back with a sticky note attached that read, "Streamline the numbers to make them pop more." I found Kiara staring at her monitor, her hands trembling with a mixture of absolute rage and professional panic. If that report went out to the client, our division's credibility would be instantly destroyed. We could not simply ignore his edits because Roland was actively monitoring Trent's integration into our workflow. So we had to adapt. I instituted a shadow protocol. My team and I stayed at the office until 10 o'clock that night. We quietly reversed every single one of Trent's elementary accounting errors, corrected the ratios, and restored the original integrity of the model. We had to make the numbers correct while formatting the presentation to look like we had incorporated his feedback. We became a highly functioning cleanup crew for a man who made triple the salary of my senior analysts. Every time Trent drafted a client proposal, Andre had to intercept it and rewrite the communication to ensure it actually complied with federal financial regulations. Every time Trent suggested a market shift, Jamal had to spend hours running dummy algorithms just to prove why the strategy would result in catastrophic losses. We were spending 20% of our billable hours insulating our clients from the senior vice president of strategy. The psychological toll on my team was heavy, but Roland's reaction to Trent's ineptitude was what truly tested my composure. At the end of the month, Roland hosted a regional review. He stood in front of the executive board and specifically highlighted Trent's contributions. He projected a heavily sanitized version of the reports my team had secretly fixed, completely attributing the success to Trent. "What Trent brings to this floor is disruptive vision," Roland announced, placing a heavy hand on his brother-in-law's shoulder. "He is not bogged down by the traditional rigid thinking that sometimes holds our directors back. He thinks completely outside the box." Roland looked directly at me when he said the word rigid. It was a calculated public insult. He was taking the flawless execution of my young, brilliant African-American team, slapping a white, unqualified face on it, and labeling it as visionary leadership. He was actively punishing us for our competence while rewarding Trent for simply existing. I sat at that conference table with my posture perfectly straight and my expression carefully neutral. I did not glare. I did not object. I nodded slightly, projecting the image of a team player absorbing executive feedback. Inside, my mind was running purely on icy logic. Roland thought he was winning a war of attrition. He thought that by forcing us to carry his dead-weight relative, he would eventually break our spirit and force me to resign in frustration. He failed to realize that every time I stayed late to fix Trent's mistakes, I was meticulously documenting the errors. I was saving the original files, tracking the time-stamped changes, and archiving the paper trail of his staggering ignorance. I was not just cleaning up a mess, I was quietly loading a weapon. Let Roland applaud the disruptive vision. Let Trent play the golden boy. I knew that a foundation built on nepotism and sheer incompetence could not sustain its own weight. I just needed to wait for Trent to make a mistake so catastrophic that even Roland could not cover it up. The waiting game, however, was not a passive endeavor. It was a daily exercise in extreme psychological endurance. Trent did not just occupy an office. His entitlement seeped under the glass doors and infected the entire 40th floor, creating an atmosphere that was thick with disrespect. While my team was at their desks by 6 in the morning, digesting global market shifts and rebalancing portfolios before the opening bell, Trent rarely made an appearance before 10:30. He would stroll through the double doors holding a green smoothie, his jacket casually slung over one shoulder, looking less like a finance executive and more like a tourist who had wandered into the wrong building. His physical presence was an active, constant disruption to our workflow. He took to practicing his putting in his office, the sharp clack of a golf ball hitting a glass return cup echoing down the corridor while Jamal was trying to run complex predictive modeling. When Andre was on a high-stakes call, reassuring a nervous tech founder about sector volatility, Trent would wander by, lean against the cubicle partition, and loudly offer completely unsolicited, terrible advice. By noon, he was gone again. His lunches were not networking opportunities designed to secure capital. They were 3-hour-long indulgences. He would return mid-afternoon smelling faintly of gin and expensive steak, completely oblivious to the frantic high-stakes environment operating around him. Worse than his absence was his blatant disregard for the regulatory framework that kept us out of federal prison. Wealth management is bound by strict compliance laws. Every quarter, the firm held mandatory risk mitigation seminars. Trent skipped 3 of them in a row. When I sent him calendar invites reminding him that attendance was legally required to maintain our divisional standing, he declined them with a single-sentence reply claiming he was prioritizing big-picture strategy over administrative housekeeping. I watched the heavy toll his behavior took on my people. Andre, who spent his days delicately managing the emotional volatility of our oldest clients, had to physically walk away from his desk whenever Trent loudly bragged in the break room about his leisurely weekends. Kiara saw her workload double. Her eyes grew heavy with dark circles, the result of staying late to double-check the compliance logs that Trent continually ignored. Jamal simply went quiet, his usual sharp humor replaced by a rigid, simmering frustration. I had asked my team to be 10 times better than anyone else in the building, and they were. But looking at Trent, they were forced to swallow the bitter reality that in Roland's world, being 10 times better still made them second-class citizens. The breaking point for team morale did not come from an accounting error or a botched client meeting. It came from a piece of paper carelessly left on the communal printer. It was late on a Thursday. Trent had bolted from the office at 4 to beat traffic for a long weekend trip. Kiara was printing out a highly detailed prospectus for a Friday morning client meeting. She found a single document stuck between her pages. It was an internal human resources summary, detailing executive compensation tiers, something Trent had printed, reviewed, and completely forgotten to collect. Kiara brought the paper into my office and closed the heavy oak door. She did not say a word. She just slid the document across my desk, her face a mask of absolute devastating betrayal. I looked down at the highlighted row bearing Trent's name. The numbers were sickening. His base salary was $400,000, which was twice what I made as the director of the division. He had a guaranteed annual bonus structure that dwarfed the combined compensation of Jamal, Kiara, and Andre. He was given stock options that vested immediately upon hiring. All of his compensation was completely untethered from actual revenue targets, client retention, or asset growth. He was being paid an exorbitant, staggering amount of corporate money to actively endanger the portfolios my team had spent 8 years building. I looked up at Kiara. A tear of pure, unadulterated frustration finally spilled over her lash line. She had student loans. She supported her younger brother through college. She was quite literally one of the most brilliant financial minds in the city, and she was making a fraction of what a man who failed his licensing exams twice was taking home. I slid the paper into my personal shredder, the mechanical grind cutting through the heavy silence of the office. I did not offer her empty corporate platitudes about fairness or how hard work always pays off. I gave her the cold, strategic truth. They do not value us because they do not understand us. I told her, keeping my voice steady and measured. Roland and Trent operate in a system built on illusions. They use money they did not earn to buy status they do not deserve. But we operate in reality. We control the actual assets. We hold the trust of the clients. That piece of paper is just a receipt for Roland's insecurity. Do not let his fragile ego dictate your self-worth. I told her to gather Jamal and Andre. When the four of us were sealed in my office, I looked at my team. The exhaustion was evident, the resentment thick enough to cut. But underneath the heavy weight of that profound injustice, the fire that I had recruited them for was still burning. I did not tell them my full plan yet. The walls of the 40th floor had too many ears, and the timing had to be absolutely flawless. But I made them a promise. I looked each of them in the eye and swore that the era of subsidizing Trent's existence was coming to an end. We were going to stop serving as the invisible safety net for a man who did not respect us. We were going to let the Golden Boy operate entirely on his own merits. And when his inevitable collapse happened, we would not be the ones buried in the rubble. The opportunity to let Trent operate without our safety net presented itself far sooner than I expected. But Roland, possessing the sharp survival instincts of a corporate parasite, anticipated the danger of Trent walking into the upcoming quarterly review with absolutely zero generated revenue. Roland knew that even the most oblivious executive board would eventually question a senior vice president of strategy who had not brought in a single dollar. He needed to manufacture a portfolio for his brother-in-law, and he intended to use my division as the supply closet. The summons came late on a Friday afternoon. In the corporate world, a Friday afternoon meeting request is a calculated act of cowardice. It is designed to deliver bad news right before the weekend, leaving the employee isolated and unable to mount a swift human resources counterattack. Roland's executive assistant, a nervous woman who actively avoided making eye contact with anyone in my division, knocked on my door and told me Roland needed to see me immediately. I locked my computer terminal, smoothed the front of my tailored skirt, and walked down the hallway to his corner office. When I opened the heavy mahogany door, the dynamic in the room was immediately clear. Roland was sitting behind his massive desk, his hands steepled in front of him. Trent was lounging on the imported leather sofa against the wall, one ankle casually resting on his knee, mindlessly scrolling through his phone. He did not even bother to look up or acknowledge my entrance. He looked entirely bored by a meeting that was about to dictate the transfer of millions of dollars. "Gabrielle, have a seat," Roland said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. His voice carried that artificial paternalistic tone he used whenever he was about to deliver a profound insult. I remained standing. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. "I prefer to stand, Roland. We have end-of-day market closures to process. What do you need?" Roland's smile tightened, but he pressed on, leaning back in his chair to project dominance. "We are approaching the end of the quarter. As you know, the executive board is flying in from New York next month to review regional performance. I want to make sure we present a unified, highly synergistic front. Trent has been doing an outstanding job conceptualizing our high-level strategy, but I want him to have a solid baseline of active accounts to showcase during the presentation." I stared at him, my expression completely unreadable. I knew exactly where this was going, but I wanted to force him to say the words out loud. "A baseline of active accounts," I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the dead air of the office. "Trent has not generated any new business since he arrived. Are you suggesting we assign him a cold calling quota?" Trent finally looked up from his phone, letting out a short, arrogant scoff. Roland held up a hand, playing the role of the benevolent peacekeeper. "Trent is an executive, Gabrielle. We do not put executives on cold call duty. He needs a starter portfolio, a curated selection of established high-net-worth accounts that he can step into as the primary relationship manager. It will elevate his visibility with the board and show that your division is embracing cross-pollination." He was using meaningless corporate buzzwords to mask blatant, unapologetic theft. He was not asking me to share resources. He was ordering me to hand over the fruits of my labor to a man who had not earned a single dime of it. "Which accounts?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. Roland picked up a single sheet of paper from his desk and slid it toward me. "I have already reviewed your client roster. I think Evelyn Sterling, Dr. Harrison Caldwell, and the Montgomery Family Trust would be perfect fits for Trent's management style." The sheer audacity of the selection nearly took my breath away. He had not just picked random clients, he had cherry-picked the crown jewels of my entire portfolio. Evelyn Sterling was a 70-year-old logistics magnate who had followed me from my days as a junior broker. I had spent countless hours sitting at her kitchen table, guiding her through the turbulent economic shifts that followed the loss of her husband. She trusted me implicitly, and her portfolio was worth over $40 million. Dr. Harrison Caldwell was a retired cardiovascular surgeon. His account was incredibly complex, heavily reliant on municipal bonds and tax-sheltered annuities that required Kiara's continuous precise algorithmic monitoring. And the Montgomery Family Trust was my ultimate triumph. It was a massive generational wealth account that I had personally wrestled away from a rival firm after 6 months of relentless, flawless pitching. The Montgomery patriarch had signed with our firm specifically because of my holistic approach to wealth preservation. Combined, those 3 accounts represented over $150 million in assets under management. They generated massive quarterly advisory fees, and Roland was casually sliding them across the desk to a man who did not even know the difference between a mutual fund and an exchange-traded fund. "Trent is not licensed to manage those accounts, Roland," I stated, anchoring my argument in undeniable regulatory fact. "He has failed his Series 7 exam twice. He legally cannot execute the trades required to maintain Dr. Caldwell's bond ladder or the Montgomery Trust's equity rebalancing. If he gives unauthorized financial advice, it is a federal violation." Roland waved his hand dismissively, completely unbothered by the threat of federal regulatory breaches. "We are not changing the operational back-end, Gabrielle. Kiara and Jamal will continue to execute the trades. Andre will continue to handle the administrative paperwork. We are just changing the face of the accounts. Trent will take over the client dinners, the quarterly review calls, and the primary relationship management. He will be listed as the lead advisor on the corporate ledger. You and your team will handle the mechanics." My mind rapidly processed the staggering reality of his demand. He wanted my team to continue doing 100% of the grueling, highly technical financial labor. Meanwhile, Trent would take over the glamorous client dinners, take full credit for the portfolio performance, and most importantly, absorb the massive commission splits and advisory fees. It was corporate sharecropping. Roland was extracting the brilliance and labor of a highly educated black team to subsidize the unearned lifestyle of his mediocre white brother-in-law. Trent smirked, tossing his phone onto the sofa cushion. "Do not worry, Gabby," he said, using a nickname I absolutely despised. "I will make sure to take them to the good steakhouses. You guys just keep the spreadsheets looking pretty, and I will handle the heavy lifting with the clients." The urge to verbally eviscerate him right there in the office was almost overwhelming. I could have listed his failures. I could have pointed out that Evelyn Sterling would eat him alive the second he tried to explain her tax liabilities. I could have flatly refused, walked out, and dared Roland to fire me for insubordination. But I looked at Roland's eyes. They were hard, challenging, and completely devoid of compromise. He wanted me to refuse. He was baiting me. If I refused a direct managerial directive, he would have documented cause to cite me for insubordination. He could formally reprimand me, freeze my team's bonuses, or begin the process of dismantling my division piece by piece under the guise of corporate restructuring. A screaming match would only lead to my termination, and if I was terminated, I could not protect my team or my clients. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch out until the atmosphere in the room became heavy and uncomfortable. I looked at the sheet of paper on Roland's desk, committing the names to memory, even though they were already permanently etched into my mind. I was not going to let a country club bureaucrat and his incompetent proxy steal my empire. I just needed to make them believe they had already won. "I will facilitate the transition," I said, my voice smooth and entirely devoid of the righteous fury burning behind my ribs. But for accounts of this magnitude, an abrupt change in primary leadership will trigger immediate panic. Evelyn Sterling does not adapt well to sudden organizational shifts. If we want to ensure zero capital flight, Trent and I need to co-manage the portfolios on paper for the remainder of the fiscal year. I used Roland's own weaponized corporate vocabulary against him. I spoke about seamless integration, client comfort algorithms, and holistic transitioning. I watched Roland relax back into his heavy leather chair, a victorious gleam lighting up his eyes. He honestly thought he had broken me. He believed that applying enough administrative pressure had forced me to bow to his authority and sacrifice my own achievements for his family's benefit. Excellent, Roland said, steepling his fingers again. I knew you would see the strategic value in this collaboration. It is a win for the entire region. Trent smirked from the sofa, completely unaware of the complex financial landmines hidden inside those three massive portfolios. Thanks, Gabby. Send over their contact sheets by the end of the day. I want to shoot them an introductory email to get the ball rolling. I will draft the communications, I replied smoothly, cutting off his initiative before he could do immediate damage. High net worth clients require a very specific cadence. I will introduce you as our new senior vice president joining the oversight committee. It adds prestige to your role without making them feel like they have been abruptly handed off to a junior broker. We want them to feel like they are getting more attention, not less. Trent nodded slowly, his ego successfully stroked by the idea of being framed as a high-level overseer. I turned on my heel and walked out of the office, closing the heavy mahogany door behind me with a soft, definitive click. I walked straight back to my division. Jamal, Kiara, and Andre were waiting at their desks, reading the subtle tension in my posture the moment I crossed the threshold. I ushered them into the glass-walled conference room and engaged the privacy blinds. When I told them Roland was absorbing our top 3 accounts for Trent, the room erupted into suppressed, furious whispers. Jamal threw his pen across the table. Andre rubbed his temples in sheer disbelief. Kiara looked like she was ready to march down to human resources and hand in her resignation right then and there. I raised a single hand, silencing the room instantly. We are not fighting this, I told them, locking eyes with each of my team members to ensure they understood the gravity of my next words. We are going to give Roland exactly what he asked for, on paper. I laid out the illusion of compliance. We would generate the quarterly reports, the tax analyses, and the risk mitigation models just as we always did. But we would slap Trent's name on the executive summary headers. We would let him take the credit in the internal corporate ledger and absorb the administrative glory. However, under absolutely no circumstances was Trent allowed to speak to Evelyn Sterling, Dr. Caldwell, or the Montgomery trustees without me physically present in the room or active on the line. The illusion required meticulous, exhausting execution. Andre created an entirely separate communication protocol just for the Golden Boy. Whenever Trent asked for client data, we handed him sanitized top-level summaries. We fed him just enough buzzwords to make him feel important, but entirely deprived him of actionable market triggers. Kiara built a digital firewall around the actual trading accounts, requiring secondary authorization from my terminal for any portfolio adjustments. We had to ensure Trent could not accidentally liquidate a multi-million-dollar municipal bond ladder while playing executive. For the next 3 weeks, Trent paraded around the 40th floor like a conquering hero. He boasted in the break room about his new portfolio, dropping Evelyn Sterling's name to junior analysts as if they were old friends. He updated his internal corporate profile to reflect the sudden $150 million bump in his assets under management. He was reveling in a victory he had not bled for. Roland eventually insisted that Trent host a welcome lunch with Evelyn Sterling to solidify the new dynamic. I orchestrated the entire event with military precision to protect the client relationship. I chose the restaurant, pre-ordered Evelyn's preferred vintage of Pinot Noir, and briefed Trent extensively on what not to say. During the actual lunch, I completely dominated the conversation, guiding Evelyn through her complex estate planning adjustments and trust allocations. Whenever Trent tried to interject with one of his marketing buzzwords about corporate synergy, I seamlessly translated his nonsense into coherent financial strategy. I made it appear to Evelyn that Trent was simply an eager, if somewhat slow, administrative aide brought along to take notes and pay the bill. Evelyn spent the entire 2 hours speaking exclusively to me, occasionally offering Trent a polite grandmotherly smile when he managed to pass the breadbasket correctly. When we returned to the office, Trent was absolutely ecstatic. Delusional and lacking any real self-awareness, he honestly believed he had crushed the meeting. He reported back to Roland that Evelyn was totally on board with his new strategic vision. Roland was thrilled. He stopped hovering over my division, satisfied that his proxy had successfully infiltrated my empire and that I had been thoroughly subdued. He stopped calling those agonizing early morning alignment meetings. He believed my compliance was absolute. By feeding their massive egos, I bought my team the one thing we needed more than anything else: unsupervised time. Roland and Trent were so blinded by their unearned victory that they stopped paying attention to the operational backend. They stopped looking at the internal compliance logs. They completely ignored the actual mechanics of the wealth management division because they were too busy admiring the shiny, prestigious exterior they had hijacked. They thought I had surrendered my armor and bowed to the corporate hierarchy. They did not realize I had just handed them a Trojan horse, buying myself the time and the dark cover I needed to prepare for total war. The silence Roland and Trent left me with was the greatest gift they could have possibly provided. By stepping back and assuming I was fully subdued, they handed me the exact operational blind spot I required to begin the extraction. I knew that fighting Roland within the confines of his own corporate structure was a losing battle. The house always wins when the house writes the rules. So I decided to burn the house down and build my own. My first move was securing the right legal architect. In the high-stakes world of wealth management, leaving a major wirehouse to start an independent firm is legally treacherous. Firms monitor every keystroke, every printed document, and every outgoing email for signs of defection. If Roland caught even a whisper of my departure, he would freeze my licenses, lock me out of the building, and immediately file temporary restraining orders to prevent me from contacting my clients. I needed a lawyer who specialized in breakaway brokers and transition protocol. I found Camille. She was a brilliant, fiercely tactical attorney operating out of a boutique firm in Midtown Atlanta. Like me, she had spent her career navigating rooms that were not designed for her to succeed in, and she had built a reputation for absolutely dismantling corporate non-solicit agreements. I did not contact her using my company cell phone or my corporate email. I bought a prepaid phone with cash and called her from my car during a weekend grocery run. When we met in a private conference room at her firm the following Tuesday, I laid out my entire portfolio, the team dynamic, and the specific client contracts. Camille reviewed the non-compete clauses buried in my employment agreements with clinical precision. She confirmed what I already suspected. As long as I adhered strictly to the protocol for broker recruiting, operating with absolute secrecy, and taking no proprietary client data before my official resignation, I could legally transition my book of business. With Camille steering the legal ship, I began the rigorous, highly confidential process of registering my own independent, registered investment advisor firm, commonly known as an RIA. Breaking away from a major wirehouse meant I would no longer be an employee generating revenue for a faceless corporate logo. I would be the CEO of my own fiduciary entity, owning 100% of my equity and retaining total control over my team and my clients. The bureaucratic hurdles were massive, and I had to clear them entirely in the shadows. I spent my evenings sitting at my kitchen island with a single desk lamp illuminating stacks of federal paperwork. I formally incorporated my new LLC, securing a discreet office space in a stunning glass building in Buckhead that offered panoramic views of the city. It was a space designed to communicate stability, wealth, and unshakable competence. Next came the federal filings. Camille and I meticulously drafted the Form ADV, the comprehensive disclosure document required by the Securities and Exchange Commission to register a new investment firm. We detailed the firm's investment strategies, fee structures, and operational compliance protocols. Every single word had to be flawless to ensure smooth federal approval without triggering any delays. Simultaneously, I had to secure a custodial partner. As an independent RIA, I needed a massive federally regulated financial institution to physically hold the client assets, execute the trades, and generate the tax statements. I vetted and selected one of the premier custodian banks in the country, an institution that catered specifically to elite independent advisors. I held secretive off-site meetings with their transition executives, outlining the projected $800 million in assets I planned to bring over. Because of my established track record and clean regulatory history, they aggressively courted my business, offering premium transition support and elite technological infrastructure. I was funding this entire venture out of my own pocket. I quietly liquidated my personal stock options and leveraged a significant portion of my own liquid capital to cover the legal fees, the office lease, and the technological setup. It was a terrifying amount of money to put on the line, but I was not gambling. I was betting on myself, and I was betting on Jamal, Kiara, and Andre. I knew that if I built a fortress where their brilliance was properly valued and compensated, they would follow me without hesitation. The psychological duality of those weeks was intense. By day, I sat in the 40th floor executive suite, nodding politely, as Trent bumbled his way through staff meetings and Roland pontificated about corporate synergy. I reviewed Trent's sanitized client emails and maintained the perfect illusion of a subdued, compliant director. But the moment I left that building, I was a general preparing for war. I coordinated with IT vendors to ensure my new office would have top-tier cybersecurity dual-monitor trading stations and predictive modeling software that matched or exceeded what we currently used. I wanted my team to walk into the new firm and immediately feel that they had been elevated, not compromised. As the weeks passed and the SEC application moved quietly through the federal approval pipeline, the trap was fully set. Roland and Trent were busy patting themselves on the back, admiring the reflection of an empire they did not build. They had no idea that the foundation beneath them had already been hollowed out. I had built the guillotine right under their noses, entirely off the corporate grid. All I needed now was the perfect moment to drop the blade. The inevitable collapse arrived on a Tuesday morning during the peak of the third quarter earnings season. The market was experiencing severe volatility, particularly within the technology sector. My team was operating at peak efficiency, navigating the turbulence with the precision of a surgical unit. Jamal was glued to his dual monitors, tracking algorithmic fluctuations. Kiara was adjusting tax loss harvesting models to protect our clients from the sudden market dips. We were in our element, functioning exactly the way a top-tier wealth management division should. Trent, however, was bored. For weeks he had been soaking in the unearned praise from Roland and the executive board. He had played the role of the visionary leader at client lunches, nodding along while I did the actual financial translation. But the illusion of competence was no longer enough for him. He wanted the thrill of the execution. He wanted to feel like a master of the universe. I could see the restless arrogance building in him every time he walked past our desks. He had been reading amateur financial blogs and watching cable news pundits, absorbing empty catchphrases about market disruption and aggressive sector rotation. He genuinely believed that trading was a game of gut instincts rather than rigorous mathematical discipline. His target was the Montgomery Family Trust. The Montgomery account was a generational wealth portfolio carefully structured and heavily vested in legacy technology stocks. These were shares that the Montgomery patriarch had acquired decades ago. The cost basis on those shares was practically zero, meaning any sale would generate a massive immediate capital gains tax liability. Kiara and I had spent months meticulously managing the trust, utilizing highly specific tax lot accounting and charitable remainder vehicles to slowly diversify their holdings without triggering a devastating tax event. It was a delicate financial ecosystem that required absolute precision. Trent did not understand cost basis. He did not understand capital gains. He only understood that the legacy tech stocks were experiencing a temporary dip, and he wanted to look like a genius by rotating those assets into a highly speculative, volatile cloud computing startup he had read about over the weekend. Because Kiara had built a digital firewall around the actual trading accounts, Trent could not execute the trade from his own terminal. His system permissions restricted him to read-only access. But Trent was a senior vice president, a title that carried dangerous weight outside of our immediate division. Frustrated by the digital block on his computer, he bypassed our local protocols entirely. He picked up his office phone, bypassed my desk, and called the firm's central execution desk in New York directly. Using his elevated corporate title and Roland's name as leverage, Trent verbally authorized the liquidation of 25% of the Montgomery Family Trust's legacy tech holdings. He ordered the central desk to immediately reinvest the capital into the speculative startup. The execution desk, assuming a senior vice president operating under a regional director, had cleared the strategy with the client, and the tax department pushed the trade through. The digital alarms on Jamal's terminal went off exactly 14 minutes later. I was in the middle of reviewing a compliance report when Jamal burst into my office. He did not knock. He closed the door behind him, his face completely drained of color. He turned his monitor screen toward me. The raw trade data was scrolling across the display in glaring red numbers. I stared at the screen, my mind instantly calculating the blast radius of the transaction. The sheer scale of the financial destruction was breathtaking. Trent had liquidated tens of millions of dollars in highly appreciated assets. By doing so, he had instantly stripped the protective tax shielding away from the trust. In a matter of seconds, he had generated a short-term and long-term capital gains tax liability that would cost the Montgomery family an astronomical sum. He had essentially handed millions of their generational wealth directly to the Internal Revenue Service out of pure, unfiltered ignorance. Furthermore, the startup he had rotated the capital into was highly illiquid and vastly outside the risk tolerance parameters legally established in the Montgomery Trust's investment policy statement. Trent had not just made a bad trade, he had breached our fiduciary duty. He had violated the core legal agreement we held with the client. If the Montgomery patriarch saw this trade execution, he would not just pull his account. He would sue the firm for gross negligence, demand full restitution for the tax liability, and report us to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The resulting investigation would completely destroy the credibility of our entire regional branch. Kiara and Andre slipped into my office behind Jamal, having seen the same alerts on their own screens. The silence in the room was suffocating. Kiara sank into a guest chair, burying her face in her hands. She had spent a year building the tax protections that Trent had just incinerated in a single phone call. Andre looked sick, knowing that he would be the one expected to answer the phone when the client inevitably called to ask why their portfolio had been turned into a speculative casino. He bypassed the local system, Jamal said, his voice a tight, furious whisper. He used his title to force the New York desk to execute the block trade. The confirmation receipts just hit the general ledger. It is locked. The trade is settled. I stood up from my desk and walked to the glass wall of my office, looking out at the bullpen. Trent was standing by the espresso machine, laughing loudly on his cell phone, casually stirring a packet of sugar into his cup. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he had just detonated a financial nuclear bomb in the middle of our highest grossing account. The anger that washed over me was cold and sharp. This was the exact catastrophe I had anticipated, but the sheer magnitude of his stupidity exceeded even my calculations. He had placed my entire team in extreme legal and professional jeopardy. If we did not handle this perfectly, the corporate fallout would sweep us all away in the collateral damage. "Do we call the client?" Andre asked, his voice steady but laced with underlying dread. "Do we try to reverse the trade?" "We cannot reverse it without triggering further compliance investigations from the federal regulators," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on Trent. "The trade is executed. The tax liability is real. If we call the client right now, we ignite a panic that will end in immediate litigation." I turned back to my team. They were looking at me, waiting for the command that would save their careers. But I knew that saving our corporate careers on the 40th floor was no longer the objective. The objective was the extraction. Trent had just handed me the catalyst I needed to burn Roland's empire to the ground, but we had to let the fire reach the executive suite first. "Say nothing to the client," I instructed, my voice radiating absolute, unshakable authority. "Say nothing to the New York desk. Do not send a single email regarding this transaction. We are going to let Roland discover the magnitude of what his golden boy just did. We are going to force him to look at the wreckage." Jamal nodded slowly, understanding the tactical shift. Kiara sat up straighter, her panic replaced by a cold, focused energy. We all knew what happens when a corporate parasite is faced with a catastrophic failure. They never take accountability. They immediately look for a scapegoat to sacrifice. I unlocked my office door and stepped back out into the hallway, leaving my team to secure their own files. I walked toward the executive boardroom, my posture perfectly rigid, my mind operating 10 steps ahead. The crisis had officially hit. The firm's most vital client relationship was bleeding out on the corporate ledger. Now all I had to do was wait for Roland to panic and watch exactly who he tried to throw to the wolves. The waiting ended at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon. That was the precise moment the Daily Trade Blotter generated its automated midday reconciliation report and hit the inbox of every regional executive. I was sitting at my desk, my eyes locked on the digital display, watching the seconds tick by. Through the glass walls of my office, I had a direct line of sight to Roland's corner suite. When the email landed, I saw Roland lean forward in his heavy leather chair. He clicked open the attachment. I counted the seconds it took for his eyes to scan down to the Montgomery Family Trust line item. It took exactly 4 seconds. Roland shot up from his chair so violently that it slammed against the credenza behind him. The artificial country club composure he wore like a second skin completely evaporated. He grabbed his desk phone, his fingers jabbing at the keypad with frantic, uncoordinated aggression. I knew exactly who he was calling. He was dialing the Central Execution Desk in New York to demand an explanation for the massive unauthorized liquidation of highly appreciated tech stocks. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When he slammed the receiver down, all the color had drained from his face. The New York desk had undoubtedly confirmed that the trade was authorized verbally by his own senior vice president of strategy. Roland burst out of his office and marched directly toward Trent, who was still lounging by the espresso machine. Roland did not yell, but the sheer panic radiating from his posture was unmistakable. He grabbed Trent by the elbow, his grip tight enough to make the younger man wince, and hauled him back into the corner office. Roland slammed the heavy mahogany door shut and aggressively yanked the privacy blinds down, sealing them off from the rest of the floor. I remained perfectly still at my desk, my hands resting lightly on my keyboard. I opened the firm's administrative software, using my director-level access to monitor the back-end trade data in real time. The digital footprint of Trent's colossal stupidity was sitting right there on the general ledger. The trade had triggered an automatic compliance alert due to the massive capital gains tax liability it generated. The Securities and Exchange Commission requires strict documentation for trades of this magnitude, specifically to ensure the advisor executing the transaction is fully licensed and acting within the client's established risk parameters. Trent was not licensed. He had no Series 7 credentials. By calling the New York desk and forcing that trade through, he had not just made a poor financial decision. He had committed a severe regulatory violation. If corporate compliance caught wind of this, Trent would be immediately terminated and barred from the financial industry for life. Furthermore, Roland would be fired and potentially investigated for gross negligence, as he was the supervising principal who had illegally installed Trent in that position. In the sterile, unforgiving world of corporate finance, panic breeds desperation. And desperate men do not take accountability, they look for a sacrifice. I kept my eyes glued to the administrative blotter on my monitor. For 20 agonizing minutes, the status of the Montgomery trade remained locked. Then the system flickered. A small yellow notification icon popped up in the corner of my screen, indicating that a manual administrative override had been initiated by a user with regional vice president credentials. Roland was inside the system. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the digital paperwork shift in real time. The firm's software logs every keystroke, but Roland was utilizing a high-level supervisory function designed to correct innocent clerical errors before the end-of-day reporting. He was not correcting an error. He was actively committing fraud. I watched the executing broker field on the screen. The internal placeholder ID that New York had temporarily assigned to Trent was suddenly wiped clean. The cursor blinked in the empty field for a fraction of a second. Then a new sequence of numbers populated the box. It was Kiara's unique registered representative code. The ice in my veins froze completely solid. Roland was not just trying to cover up the trade. He was maliciously, intentionally altering the digital timestamps and trade authorizations to frame my top analyst. He was shifting the entire burden of the catastrophic tax liability and the federal regulatory violation onto Kiara's shoulders. The sheer breathtaking evil of the move was staggering. Kiara had spent months meticulously building the tax protections for the Montgomery Trust. She knew that account better than anyone in the building. To an outside compliance auditor looking at a falsified digital record, it might seem plausible that the senior analyst managing the account had executed the trade. Roland was counting on that superficial plausibility. He was also counting on the fact that Kiara was a young African-American woman without a powerful corporate sponsor, assuming she lacked the political capital to fight back against a regional vice president. He was willing to destroy her career, strip her of her licenses, and expose her to crippling federal investigations, all to protect his mediocre, incompetent brother-in-law. I sat in my office and stared at the falsified ledger. The rage I felt was no longer a simmering frustration over office politics or stolen credit. It was a cold, absolute demand for corporate execution. Roland had just crossed the Rubicon. By altering those digital records, he had escalated this from a battle of egos into a federal crime. I glanced out through my glass wall toward the bullpen. Kiara was sitting at her desk, typing furiously, completely unaware that the man in the corner office had just signed her professional death warrant. She was loyal, brilliant, and entirely innocent. Roland believed she was an easy target, a disposable asset he could throw onto the tracks to stop the oncoming train. He fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. He thought he was playing a game of corporate hierarchy against an isolated analyst. He did not realize he had just declared war on a woman who had spent 8 years building an impenetrable fortress around her team. The system refreshed one final time, locking the falsified data into the permanent daily record. Roland had finalized the cover-up. He had erased Trent's involvement entirely and painted a massive target on Kiara's back. The digital trap was set, and now he needed to spring it in person to make the illusion stick. He needed to create a paper trail with human resources to legitimize the termination he was about to orchestrate. I did not panic. I did not rush out to warn Kiara. I simply moved my hand to my mouse and prepared to execute my countermeasure. I knew exactly what Roland was going to do next. He was going to call an immediate closed-door meeting. He was going to play the role of the disappointed, stern executive, uncovering a devastating mistake made by a careless subordinate. He was going to demand accountability from the very woman he had just framed. I closed the administrative window on my monitor and waited for my desk phone to ring. The trap was set, but Roland was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was the one stepping inside it. My desk phone shrilled exactly 3 minutes later. The harsh sound cut through the quiet hum of my office. I picked up the receiver with a steady hand. Roland's executive assistant was on the line, her voice tight with uncharacteristic urgency. She informed me that Roland requested my immediate presence in the Human Resources Department on the 39th floor, and he explicitly required me to bring Kiara with me. I hung up the phone and walked out to the bullpen. Kiara was still deep in a spreadsheet, completely focused on optimizing a municipal bond ladder. I tapped her desk lightly. I kept my voice entirely neutral, telling her to grab a notepad and follow me downstairs. She looked up slightly confused by the sudden summons, but she trusted me implicitly. She grabbed her leather portfolio and fell into step beside me as we walked to the elevators. The Human Resources Department operated in a sterile, hyper-lit corridor that always smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and corporate anxiety. We were directed into a large glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall. Roland was already sitting at the head of the long table. Next to him sat David, the Regional Director of Human Resources, a man whose entire career consisted of silently pushing termination paperwork across tables. Roland had arranged his face into a mask of deep paternal disappointment. It was a masterful performance. He looked like a leader bearing the heavy burden of a terrible truth. I took a seat opposite him, and Kiara sat beside me, her confusion slowly morphing into apprehension. She could feel the aggressive shift in the room's atmosphere. Roland did not waste time with pleasantries. He pushed a thick manila folder across the polished table. He stated that a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty had just occurred within my division. He opened the folder, revealing printed screenshots of the trade blotter. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the highlighted line item detailing the massive, unauthorized liquidation of the Montgomery Family Trust's legacy tech holdings. He then turned his gaze directly to Kiara. He informed the room that a junior analyst had bypassed the chain of command, executing a highly speculative and completely unapproved block trade. He stated that this reckless action had instantly triggered a devastating capital gains tax liability for the firm's most vital client. Finally, he tapped the bottom of the printed page, revealing the falsified digital signature. He explicitly stated that the system logs confirmed Kiara had executed the trade from her terminal. The color drained from Kiara's face so fast I thought she might actually faint. She stared at the highlighted paper, her eyes wide with absolute unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth to speak, but initially no sound came out. When she finally found her voice, it was a high, trembling whisper of pure denial. She insisted she had never touched the Montgomery equities. She explained that she had been locked out of the primary trading portal all afternoon and had spent the last 3 hours strictly running risk assessments on bond ladders. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, begging me to tell them there was a mistake. Roland cut her off immediately. His voice was sharp, loud, and designed to induce panic. He told her that lying to human resources would only escalate this from a fireable offense to a federal investigation. He leaned forward, utilizing his physical size to intimidate her. He stated that the digital timestamps were irrefutable. "The system does not lie," he told her, delivering the statement with such conviction that David from Human Resources nodded in solemn agreement. Kiara began to hyperventilate. The reality of what she was being accused of was crashing down on her. A regulatory violation of this magnitude would not just result in her termination. It would strip her of her hard-earned financial licenses permanently, blacklist her from the wealth management industry, and potentially expose her to severe civil litigation. Her entire career, her entire life's work was being dismantled in front of her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she desperately tried to explain the impossibility of the accusation. I sat perfectly still, observing the execution. I did not reach out to comfort Kiara. I did not raise my voice to defend her. I watched Roland operate. Roland let Kiara panic for a full minute before he raised a hand to silence her, transitioning into the next phase of his manipulation. He looked at me, projecting the image of a merciful executive. He stated that his first instinct was to call corporate security and march Kiara out of the building. He claimed he was fully prepared to report the breach to the Securities and Exchange Commission immediately. However, he continued, he respected the division I had built. He claimed he was willing to extend an unprecedented measure of grace to protect the firm's integrity and avoid a public scandal. Instead of immediate termination and federal reporting, he was officially placing Kiara on a 90-day performance improvement plan. He presented a new stack of paperwork demanding Kiara sign the PIP, acknowledging her catastrophic error. He framed this blackmail as a second chance, a generous opportunity for her to rehabilitate her career under his direct supervision. It was a brilliant, cowardly maneuver. By placing her on a PIP, Roland kept the incident internal. He prevented an immediate compliance audit that would have scrutinized the back-end system logs and uncovered his digital forgery. He was silencing Kiara through fear, keeping the threat of the SEC dangling over her head to ensure she never spoke of the trade again. He was officially branding her as a liability, providing him with a documented paper trail to fire her quietly a few weeks down the line once the dust had settled. David slid a pen across the table toward Kiara. He told her that signing the document was the only way to retain her employment. Kiara's hand shook violently as she reached for the pen. She was a brilliant analyst, but she was entirely unprepared for this level of corporate warfare. She looked at me one last time, completely broken, ready to sign a false confession just to survive the afternoon. I placed my hand firmly over hers, stopping her fingers inches from the pen. The room went dead silent. Roland narrowed his eyes, a flicker of genuine irritation breaking through his disappointed leader facade. He warned me that interfering with human resources protocols would put my own employment in jeopardy. I looked directly into Roland's eyes. I did not blink. I projected absolute chilling compliance. I told him that I completely understood the gravity of the situation. I stated that my division takes fiduciary responsibility very seriously, and I would personally ensure that the terms of the performance improvement plan were met with absolute rigor. I told Roland that Kiara was too distraught to fully comprehend the generosity of his offer right now, but I would take responsibility for her signature and deliver the signed documents to David's desk before the end of the business day. I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. I instructed Kiara to gather her things. Roland stared at me, searching my face for any sign of defiance or suspicion. He found absolutely nothing. He saw exactly what he wanted to see, a defeated director bowing to his authority, sacrificing her own team member to protect her division's status. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, victorious smile spreading across his face. He dismissed us, telling me he expected the signed paperwork by 5 o'clock. I guided Kiara out of the glass-walled conference room and back into the sterile hallway. She was trembling uncontrollably, quietly sobbing as we stepped onto the elevator. She asked me why I did not defend her. She asked me how she was supposed to sign a confession for a crime she did not commit. I did not answer her until the elevator doors slid shut, sealing us off from the human resources floor. I turned to her, my expression shifting from corporate compliance to cold, sharp focus. I told her to wipe her face and stand up straight. I promised her she was not going to sign a single piece of paper and she was not going to lose her licenses. Roland thought he had just successfully buried the evidence of his brother-in-law's incompetence by framing my best analyst. He believed he had trapped us in a corner, but he had fundamentally miscalculated. By dragging us into human resources and demanding a physical signature, he had just given me the exact window of time I needed to secure the digital guillotine. We walked back onto the 40th floor, and I headed straight for my terminal. The real war was about to begin. We stepped off the elevator and back onto the 40th floor. The atmosphere in the bullpen was suffocating. Jamal and Andre were standing by Kiara's desk, their faces drawn tight with anxiety. They looked up as we approached, searching my expression for any sign of a verdict. I gave a microscopic shake of my head, a silent command to hold their questions. Trent was back at the espresso machine, laughing loudly with a junior analyst about a weekend trip to the Hamptons. He looked entirely unbothered, perfectly insulated by his own ignorance and his brother-in-law's protection. I felt a surge of cold, focused adrenaline. Every second mattered. I guided Kiara to her desk and told her in a low, firm voice to open a mundane spreadsheet and stare at it. I ordered Jamal and Andre to return to their stations and continue executing their afternoon trades as if absolutely nothing had happened. We needed to project the image of a defeated, terrified division. Roland would be watching us from his glass office, looking for any signs of insubordination or panic. I walked into my corner office, closed the heavy oak door, and engaged the privacy blinds. I sat down at my terminal, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. When I built this wealth management division 8 years ago, I worked directly with the firm's chief technology officers to design our specific risk assessment architecture. During that implementation phase, they granted me a highly elevated legacy executive administrative access to the back-end servers. It was a level of clearance that superseded the standard regional vice president permissions. Roland had no idea I possessed it. He operated on the superficial, user-facing layers of our software. He thought altering the visible ledger was enough to bury the truth. He was about to find out that the digital footprint of corporate fraud is permanent. I bypassed the standard employee portal and initiated a secure shell connection directly into the firm's central mainframe. I navigated past the polished graphical interfaces and dove straight into the raw, unedited server logs. the screen filled with lines of dense cascading code. I ran a query isolating the exact time frame of the disastrous Montgomery Family Trust liquidation. The superficial record displayed exactly what Roland had engineered. It showed the trade execution and listed Kiara's unique representative code as the authorizing agent. But I was not looking at the superficial record. I dug deeper, accessing the machine access control addresses and the specific Internet Protocol routing data for that exact transaction. The truth illuminated the screen in stark, undeniable alphanumeric sequences. The initial trade authorization did not originate from Kiara's workstation. The internal Internet Protocol address logged at the exact moment of the trade belonged to the terminal located in the office right next to mine, Trent's office. The raw data showed that Trent's machine had attempted to access the Montgomery portal, hit the firewall Kiara had built, and subsequently failed. 2 minutes later, the Central Execution Desk in New York logged an incoming verbal authorization, overriding the digital block. The timestamps aligned perfectly. Trent had hit the wall, picked up his phone, and used his fabricated title to force the New York brokers to dump the tech stocks. Now I needed the final fatal piece of the puzzle. I needed to prove the cover-up. I ran a secondary diagnostic query, this time tracking administrative overrides executed within our regional branch during the afternoon hours. The system returned a massive cluster of back-end activity. At precisely 2:22 in the afternoon, an administrative user accessed the Montgomery trade blotter. The user credentials belonged to Roland. The server logs recorded every single keystroke he made during his frantic attempt to save his brother-in-law. I watched the digital ghost of his fraud play out on my monitor. The logs showed Roland highlighting the executing broker field. They showed him deleting the temporary identification number the New York desk had assigned to Trent. And they showed him manually typing in Kiara's registered credentials, forcibly injecting her identity into the catastrophic transaction. He had locked the record and triggered the final reporting sequence, sealing his crime into the firm's daily ledger. Roland had not simply broken a corporate guideline. He had committed a felony under the Securities Exchange Act. By framing a licensed broker for an unauthorized trade, he was tampering with federally mandated financial records. I had them. I had the indisputable federal-level proof of gross negligence, unauthorized trading by an unlicensed employee, and deliberate malicious corporate fraud executed by a regional vice president. I opened the locked drawer of my desk and extracted a brand-new military-grade encrypted external hard drive. I had purchased it weeks ago when I first began laying the groundwork for my independent firm, knowing I might need a secure vault for my own transition documents. The firm employed an aggressive cybersecurity vendor that automatically flagged mass data exports to external drives. To bypass this, I routed the data transfer through a localized diagnostic port designed for offline server maintenance. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I exported the raw server data packets, the Internet Protocol logs, the terminal identifiers, and the unedited original trade blotters. I downloaded the exact keystroke sequences proving Roland's administrative override. I packaged the entire catastrophic event into a heavily encrypted password-protected digital file. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen, my heart pounding a steady rhythmic beat against my ribs. Every passing moment was a risk, but I kept my breathing slow and even. When the transfer reached 100%, I safely ejected the drive and slipped it into the hidden interior pocket of my blazer. The digital guillotine was officially secured. I unlocked my office door and walked back out to the bullpen. The atmosphere was still suffocatingly tense. I approached Kiara's desk and dropped a freshly printed blank performance improvement plan document in front of her. It was the exact form Roland had tried to force upon her in human resources. I had printed a duplicate from the corporate intranet. I leaned down, resting my hands on her desk so I could speak directly into her ear without anyone else hearing. I told her to pick up a pen and sign the bottom line. I instructed her to make the signature messy, indicating distress. Kiara looked up at me, panic flashing in her eyes again. She whispered that she could not sign a confession, that it would destroy her career. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered absolute certainty. I needed her to understand that this was not a surrender. This was a tactical retreat. I told her the document was meaningless. I told her that Roland needed a piece of paper to feel victorious, and we were going to give him an empty victory to keep him blind to the ambush we were about to unleash. I told her the actual evidence of her innocence was currently sitting in my jacket pocket, and that Roland's career was already over. Kiara exhaled a shaky breath. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen and scribbled a jagged, erratic signature across the bottom of the page. I took the document, signed my own name on the supervisor line with perfectly steady strokes, and walked it directly down to the Human Resources Department. I handed the folder to David's assistant at exactly 4:55 in the afternoon. I walked back to the elevators, projecting the image of a completely broken director who had just sacrificed her best employee to survive. Let Roland celebrate his brilliant manipulation. Let Trent boast about his executive prowess. They were throwing a victory party on a ship that was already sinking to the bottom of the ocean. The 3 days following Kiara's forced signature on the performance improvement plan were an absolute masterclass in psychological endurance. We maintained the illusion of a broken division with flawless precision. Kiara sat at her desk, with her shoulders slumped, interacting with no one. Jamal and Andre kept their heads down, their eyes locked on their monitors, operating in total silence. To the casual observer on the 40th floor, my team looked entirely defeated. We projected the exact image of submission that Roland and Trent required to feel secure in their unearned victory. But a victory built on fraud is incredibly fragile, and a fragile ego requires constant, exhausting validation. Trent had successfully evaded the consequences of his disastrous trade, but he could not evade his own profound inadequacy. Every time he walked out of his office to refill his artisan coffee or take one of his extended lunches, he had to walk past the bullpen. He had to walk past Jamal, Kiara, and Andre. My team never said a word to him. They never glared. They simply existed in their space, executing highly complex financial strategies with the kind of quiet, brilliant competence that Trent could not replicate in 100 lifetimes. But for a man like Trent, their very existence was an accusation. He knew that they knew the truth. He knew that Kiara was bearing the weight of a federal regulatory violation that he had committed. That unspoken reality began to eat away at his artificial confidence. His arrogance slowly curdled into a deep paranoid resentment. He started avoiding eye contact with Andre in the break room. He would visibly flinch if Jamal stood up too quickly from his desk. He was a fraud, terrified of the people he had wronged, and in true corporate parasite fashion, he decided to weaponize his own guilt by playing the victim. The catalyst for his ultimate power play occurred on a Thursday morning just hours before I was scheduled to attend the high-stakes client lunch in Buckhead that would secure my final major account transfer. I was at my desk organizing the prospectus for the meeting when Roland's executive assistant appeared at my door. She informed me that Roland needed a brief operational sync in his office. When I crossed the threshold into the corner suite, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Roland was seated behind his massive desk, his expression arranged into a mask of grave concern. Trent was pacing the length of the office, running a hand nervously through his hair, projecting the image of a man under immense psychological distress. I took my seat across from Roland, keeping my posture perfectly rigid and my face entirely unreadable. I asked what the operational issue was, noting that I had a critical client acquisition lunch in less than 2 hours. Roland folded his hands together. He stated that we needed to address a severe cultural issue within my division. He turned the floor over to his brother-in-law. Trent stopped pacing and leaned heavily against the leather sofa. He let out a long, theatrical sigh. He complained that the atmosphere in the wealth management bullpen had become entirely toxic. He stated that he was trying to implement his high-level strategic vision for the region, but he was facing constant unspoken resistance from my analysts. He specifically named Jamal and Kiara. He claimed that the way they looked at him when he walked past their desks was hostile. He used words like aggressive energy and insubordinate posturing. He told Roland that operating in the same physical space as my team was giving him severe anxiety. He actually used the word anxiety to describe the discomfort of having to look at the Black professionals whose careers he was actively trying to destroy. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his complaint. I was listening to a 30-something man who collected a $400,000 salary, who skipped mandatory compliance meetings, and who had just committed massive financial fraud, claim that two silent, hard-working analysts were triggering his mental health simply by breathing in his peripheral vision. It was the ultimate weaponization of corporate human resources language. He was actively destroying my team, and yet he was demanding to be treated as the victim of their silent suffering. Trent did not stop there. He specifically targeted Kiara using the falsified trade as ammunition. He stated that ever since she was placed on her performance improvement plan, her attitude had become a massive liability. He claimed she was disgruntled and unpredictable. He told Roland that he no longer felt comfortable leaving confidential strategy documents on his desk because he feared my team might attempt to sabotage his work out of spite. Roland nodded along to this absurd, paranoid monologue with deep paternal sympathy. He validated every single one of Trent's baseless claims. He looked at me, his eyes hard and uncompromising. Roland stated that the firm had a zero-tolerance policy for hostile work environments. He claimed that we could not have our senior vice president of strategy feeling unsafe in his own executive suite. Roland then pivoted to his solution. He utilized Kiara's fabricated trading error as the ultimate justification. He stated that a team under a formal disciplinary review should not be occupying premium real estate on the executive floor. He suggested that my division required a physical restructuring to promote better operational flow and to protect Trent's peace of mind. He told me that my team was a distraction, a dark cloud hanging over the firm's golden hire. I understood exactly what they were doing. This was not about office geography. This was an eradication campaign. Roland was clearing the board. He wanted to physically remove the visual reminders of his own fraud, and he wanted to grant Trent undisputed ownership of the 40th floor. I looked at Trent, who was watching me closely, waiting for an emotional outburst. He wanted me to defend my team. He wanted me to raise my voice to argue about fairness, so he could point a finger and claim I was exhibiting the exact same aggressive energy he was complaining about. I denied him the satisfaction. I applied cold, calculating logic to the situation. I knew that the physical location of my team's desks was completely irrelevant to the endgame I had already set in motion. The encrypted hard drive containing their federal crimes was safely locked away. My independent firm was legally registered. My client extraction strategy was fully primed. I just needed to close the real estate developer in Buckhead to finalize the initial capital transfer. I looked back at Roland. I told him that I understood Trent's concerns regarding the division's atmosphere. I stated that I had a highly sensitive multi-million-dollar client acquisition lunch to attend, and I could not delay my departure. I told Roland that we could discuss the specific details of the physical restructuring and seating arrangements when I returned to the office that afternoon. Roland offered a tight, victorious smile, assuming my compliance was a sign of total defeat. He told me to go secure the client, and that he would handle the logistics of the restructuring while I was gone. I stood up, smoothed my tailored skirt, and walked out of the office without a second glance at Trent. I stepped onto the elevator and rode it down to the lobby, leaving the building to secure my final client. I knew exactly what Roland was planning to do the second my car pulled out of the parking garage. I knew he was going to use my absence to strike at my team. I simply did not care where he moved their desks, because I knew those desks were going to be permanently empty by Monday morning. The real estate developer sitting across from me in the private dining room of the Buckhead Steakhouse had a reputation for being notoriously difficult to close. He demanded absolute competence and aggressive market foresight. For 90 minutes, I systematically broke down his existing portfolio, identifying every tax inefficiency and structural weakness his current advisors had ignored. I presented the predictive models Kiara had built and the risk mitigation algorithms Jamal had perfected. I did not rely on charm or corporate buzzwords. I hit him with raw, undeniable data. By the time the waiter cleared our plates, the developer was completely sold. He signed the transfer paperwork with a heavy gold pen, effectively shifting $45 million in assets under my direct management. I had secured the final crucial anchor for my independent firm. The breakaway portfolio was now fully primed. I offered him a firm handshake, thanked him for his trust, and walked out into the warm Georgia afternoon. As I waited for the valet to bring my car around, I reached into my purse and retrieved my encrypted prepaid phone. I kept it powered off during client meetings to maintain absolute focus, but the moment the screen lit up, the device began vibrating violently in my palm. There were 47 unread messages in the secure chat channel I had established with my team. I stood in the shade of the restaurant awning and read through the real-time documentation of Roland's final power play. He had not wasted a single second after I left the building. He had timed his strike perfectly, knowing that my absence removed the only shield protecting my team from his administrative authority. According to Jamal's messages, Roland had marched into the wealth management bullpen flanked by 2 uniformed building security guards and the head of facilities management. They were pushing 3 large plastic rolling bins filled with flattened cardboard boxes. Roland did not call my team into a conference room to deliver the news privately. He stood in the center of the open floor, ensuring that every junior broker, administrative assistant, and passing executive could hear his announcement. He initiated a public execution. Roland announced to the entire 40th floor that my division was undergoing an immediate, mandatory operational quarantine. He weaponized the catastrophic tech trade that his own brother-in-law had executed, using the falsified digital records as his ultimate justification. He loudly referenced severe regulatory vulnerabilities and recent catastrophic lapses in fiduciary duty. He explicitly mentioned that a senior member of the team had been placed on a formal performance improvement plan for unauthorized trading. He painted Kiara as a massive corporate liability and framed the rest of my team as collateral risks, who required strict isolation to protect the firm's integrity. He ordered them to pack their desks immediately. Jamal's texts painted a vivid, sickening picture of the humiliation that followed. The security guards stood by with their arms crossed, treating my brilliant, high-performing financial analysts like common criminals who had just been caught stealing office supplies. Roland instructed facilities management to hand out the cheap cardboard boxes. He gave my team exactly 20 minutes to clear out 8 years of hard-earned professional achievements. While Kiara was weeping silently, carefully wrapping the dual master's degrees she had framed on her desk, Trent decided to make his grand entrance. Trent strolled into the bullpen holding a tape measure. Completely ignoring the devastating emotional toll unfolding around him, he began loudly measuring the dimensions of my corner office. Andre sent a message detailing how Trent actively complained about the placement of my custom mahogany desk, telling Roland that the energy of the room felt too restrictive and that he needed to bring in a feng shui consultant. As Andre carried his first box toward the hallway, Trent actually had the audacity to tell him to be careful not to scuff the glass partitions on his way out, because Trent wanted the suite looking pristine for his upcoming client meetings. It was a masterclass in corporate cruelty. Roland was stripping them of their physical status to break their psychological resolve. He was taking a team of highly educated, profoundly successful African-American professionals and parading their demotion in front of the entire region, all to clear a path for an unqualified, deeply incompetent white man who had failed his basic licensing exams. Before my car even arrived at the valet stand, my corporate phone chimed with an incoming email notification. I opened it to find a region-wide memorandum blasted to every employee in the building. The subject line read, "Organizational Realignment and Strategic Elevation." I read Roland's corporate doublespeak with cold, analytical detachment. The email celebrated the firm's commitment to fostering an environment of absolute compliance and transparency. It framed the eviction of my team as a necessary relocation to a dedicated compliance zone designed to strictly monitor our operational workflow. In the very next paragraph, Roland triumphantly announced that Trent was officially taking over the executive suite to spearhead the region's new high-level client acquisition strategy. Roland believed he had achieved total victory. He believed that by exiling us to the sub-basement, he had humiliated us into permanent submission. He thought he had severed our connection to the corporate power structure and neutralized my authority. I handed my valet ticket to the attendant, tipped him generously, and slid into the driver's seat of my car. I did not feel a single ounce of panic as I merged onto the highway, and drove back toward the downtown skyline. I felt an intense, crystalline sense of clarity. In warfare, the most dangerous mistake a commander can make is giving an enemy combatant the cover of darkness. Roland was so obsessed with the country club optics of the 40th floor that he failed to realize the strategic advantage he had just handed me. He wanted us isolated. He wanted us out of sight. He wanted us disconnected from the daily surveillance of the executive suite. By banishing my team to a windowless concrete bunker next to the freight elevators, Roland had just completely removed us from his line of sight. He had given us an unregulated, unmonitored operational blind spot. We no longer had to hide our whispers in the break room or engage the privacy blinds in the glass conference rooms. We were now operating entirely in the shadows, which was the exact environment I needed to execute the mass resignation and the $800 million capital transfer. I pulled into the corporate parking garage, my mind operating with lethal precision. I rode the elevator up from the parking deck, knowing exactly what I was going to find when the doors opened on the 40th floor. I knew my team would be standing in the hallway, clutching their cardboard boxes, feeling as though their entire world had just collapsed. I knew Roland would be watching them, soaking in the visible proof of his dominance. The elevator chimed, signaling my arrival at the executive level. The heavy metal doors began to slide open, revealing the polished marble corridor and the culmination of Roland's malicious power play. I adjusted my posture, ensuring my expression projected absolute terrifying calm. It was time to show Roland exactly what happens when you try to bury a team that already owns the shovels. I stepped off the elevator and locked eyes with my team. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer any immediate comfort. I simply turned and led them past the polished brass passenger lifts, directing them toward the heavy industrial metal doors of the building's freight elevator. This was the conveyance reserved for garbage removal, bulk deliveries, and night shift maintenance crews. We stepped into the massive steel cage in complete silence. I pressed the button for the lowest possible level. The descent was excruciatingly slow. The metal box groaned and shuddered as it dropped 40 stories, carrying us away from the panoramic views and the sunlight. I watched the digital floor indicator tick downward until it hit a negative number. The doors ground open with a harsh mechanical screech, revealing the physical reality of Roland's power play. The smell hit us the moment we stepped out of the elevator. It was a suffocating mixture of damp concrete, harsh industrial cleaning fluid, and decades of stagnant air. We walked down a narrow corridor lined with exposed, rattling pipes until we reached the room Roland had designated as our new operational hub. It was not a workspace. It was a glorified storage closet that had been hastily cleared out to accommodate our banishment. The carpet beneath our feet was a mottled, sickly gray, stained with mystery spills and peeling violently at the corners. Overhead, a single row of outdated fluorescent tube lights buzzed with a relentless, maddening hum. One of the bulbs was failing, casting a nauseating, erratic strobe effect across the far wall. There were 4 desks shoved haphazardly into the center of the room. They were not the sleek, ergonomic dual-monitor workstations we had utilized upstairs. They were chipped, mismatched laminate tables salvaged from some discontinued branch office years ago. There were no windows. There was no natural light. There was just the claustrophobic embrace of 4 cinder block walls and the constant deafening vibration of the building's main HVAC system running directly above our heads. Andre was the first to move. He walked over to the nearest chipped table and dropped his cardboard box onto its surface. The heavy thud echoed hollowly in the miserable room. Kiara hugged her arms tightly around herself, shivering in the aggressive chill of the uninsulated subterranean space. Jamal paced the perimeter of the room like a caged animal, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched rapidly in his cheek. We were experiencing total corporate isolation. We had been entirely erased from the building's ecosystem. Down here, there would be no casual interactions with other executives. No one would pass our desks on the way to the break room. No one would see the grueling, highly technical financial architecture we built every single day. Roland had effectively buried us alive. Then the sharp, simultaneous ping of corporate email notifications broke the heavy silence. The sound echoed from Jamal's pocket, Andre's phone, and my own device. I pulled out my phone, the screen illuminating the dim space. The subject line glared back at me. Organizational realignment and strategic elevation. I read the words silently as my team checked their own devices. Roland had pulled out all the stops to twist the knife. He praised the firm's forward-thinking momentum and highlighted the absolute necessity of creating a dynamic, centralized client experience hub on the executive floor. He wrote about modernizing our wealth management approach and fostering an environment of elite corporate synergy. And there, in the second paragraph, was the killing blow. Roland officially welcomed his brother-in-law into my corner office. He congratulated Trent on taking the helm of the region's top-tier client acquisition strategy. He actually referred to Trent as a disruptive visionary who was poised to elevate the firm's legacy accounts to unprecedented heights. Roland concluded the main body of the email by inviting the entire building staff to stop by the executive suite, grab a coffee, and personally welcome Trent to his new home. At the very bottom of the page, buried in a dismissive footnote, Roland addressed our eviction. He stated that the operational mechanics of the wealth management division had been relocated to the lower level to ensure a distraction-free compliance zone. He did not use our names. He did not mention the $800 million in assets we managed. He relegated our 8 years of industry-leading performance to a logistical housekeeping update. Kiara dropped her phone onto the laminate table. A single ragged sob tore from her throat. It was the devastating sound of a brilliant professional having her dignity ripped away and handed to a mediocre establishment. Jamal slammed his fist against the cinder-block wall, the impact cracking sharply over the buzz of the failing lights. He turned to me, his eyes burning with a mixture of profound betrayal and desperate expectation. He had trusted me with his career, and this was where my leadership had landed him. I felt the familiar cold burn of righteous fury radiating through my chest. Roland wanted this email to be the final nail in our coffin. He wanted to parade his unqualified proxy around the sunlit penthouse while we choked on dust in the dark. He wanted to break my team's spirit so thoroughly that they would either resign quietly by the end of the week or submit entirely to his authority. He wanted me to look around this miserable, forgotten room and feel the crushing, inescapable weight of my own powerlessness. But as I looked around that windowless concrete bunker, I did not see a graveyard. I saw a tactical command center. I saw absolute unmonitored privacy. I saw an environment completely disconnected from the corporate surveillance network, the administrative assistants, and the prying eyes of the executive floor. Roland was throwing a victory party upstairs, leaving his front door wide open while he celebrated his stolen glory. He had locked us in the dark, failing to realize that the dark was exactly what I needed to develop the film. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked to the center of the room. It was time to show my team exactly why I had let Roland win this battle. I walked to the center of the chipped laminate tables, the harsh fluorescent light casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete floor. Jamal turned to face me, his chest heaving. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his corporate security badge, and dropped it onto the desk with a sharp clatter. He told me he was done. He said he respected me more than anyone in this industry, but he absolutely refused to spend another second generating wealth for a firm that treated him like garbage. Andre nodded slowly in agreement, his usual diplomatic calm completely fractured. He stated that he had already started mentally drafting his resignation letter the moment the freight elevator doors opened. Kiara did not say anything, but she zipped her cardigan up to her chin and reached for the handles of her cardboard box, ready to walk out into the subterranean parking garage and never look back. I let them feel that anger. They had earned every single ounce of it, but I could not let them walk away. If they resigned now, they would be leaving with nothing, and Roland would absorb our entire $800 million portfolio by default. He would win by forfeit. I placed both of my hands flat on the table in front of me, anchoring myself in the center of their frustration. I locked eyes with Jamal first, then Andre, and finally Kiara. I kept my voice incredibly low and remarkably steady, ensuring the acoustics of the concrete room carried every single syllable with absolute clarity. I told them to leave their security badges on the table and take their hands off their boxes. I told them that walking out right now was exactly what Roland was praying they would do. Resigning in a fit of emotional outrage would validate every racist, condescending assumption he had about our professionalism. It would make his hostile takeover effortless. Jamal crossed his arms, his jaw still tight. He asked me what the alternative was. He asked if I honestly expected them to sit in this freezing bunker and run analytics while Trent drank scotch in our old office. I smiled, and this time it was a genuine expression of cold, predatory anticipation. I told Jamal that I did not expect them to run a single analytical model for this firm ever again. The three of them froze, the shift in my tone capturing their absolute attention. The heavy vibration of the building's heating system hummed above us, masking our voices from anyone who might be walking down the exterior hallway. I explained the tactical reality of our situation. I pointed to the cinder block walls and the heavy metal doors. I reminded them that upstairs on the 40th floor, corporate compliance monitored every single breath we took. They tracked our printer usage, our phone records, our screen time, and our restroom breaks. But down here in this forgotten storage closet, we were completely off the grid. There were no security cameras in the corners. There were no administrative assistants walking past to spy on our monitors. Roland had effectively blinded himself. He was so eager to humiliate us that he had voluntarily relinquished his only method of surveillance. I told them I needed exactly 48 hours. I needed 2 days of absolute blind, unquestioning trust. I reminded them of the past 8 years. I reminded Kiara of the time I stood between her and a hostile compliance auditor until the auditor backed down. I reminded Jamal of the time I bet my entire annual bonus on his predictive algorithm when the rest of the executive board laughed at a bet that netted our division $20 million in a single quarter. I reminded Andre of the countless times we had navigated the treacherous exclusionary waters of elite wealth management together, protecting each other from the constant microaggressions of the old guard. I had never led them astray. I had never asked them to compromise their dignity for a corporate paycheck. I asked them to look at me and recognize that I was not a woman who surrendered her empire without a fight. I told them that Roland and Trent were currently celebrating a victory they had not earned, standing on a foundation they did not build. What they did not know was that the foundation was completely rigged with explosives. I revealed to my team, keeping my voice barely above a whisper, that I possessed irrefutable digital proof of Trent's catastrophic unauthorized trade and Roland's subsequent federal cover-up. I told Kiara that the system logs proving her innocence were already locked away on an encrypted military-grade hard drive safely tucked inside my blazer pocket. Kiara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as the profound relief washed over her features. The paralyzing fear of federal prosecution vanished from her eyes, instantly replaced by a fierce, undeniable spark of retaliation. Jamal uncrossed his arms, leaning forward over the chipped desk. The anger in his posture dissolved, shifting into sharp, calculating focus. Andre let out a low, steady breath, shaking his head with a slow smile of profound realization. They understood. They saw the chessboard exactly as I did. I laid out the terms of my promise. I told them that if they gave me these next 48 hours, they would never have to answer to a man like Roland again. They would never have to subsidize another incompetent nepotism hire. I promised them that when we finally left this building, we would not be carrying our belongings in cheap cardboard boxes. We would be walking out the front doors as owners, taking our entire portfolio with us and leaving Roland to explain a catastrophic $800 million hemorrhage to the executive board. I held out my hand over the center of the table. There was no hesitation. Jamal placed his hand on top of mine, his grip firm and resolute. Kiara placed her hand over his, her chin held high, the tears completely gone from her face. Andre completed the circle, his expression radiating absolute, unwavering loyalty. We stood there in the flickering, nauseating light of the sub-basement, surrounded by damp walls and rattling pipes. We were physically at the lowest possible point in the corporate structure, but the energy radiating between the four of us was lethal. We were no longer employees of the firm. We were an independent strike team operating entirely behind enemy lines. I instructed them to unpack their laptops and boot up their encrypted secondary drives. The waiting was over. It was time to initiate the extraction. I reached into the interior compartment of my leather briefcase and bypassed the standard corporate folders. I pulled out 3 thick, professionally bound documents printed on heavy premium cardstock. The sharp rustle of the thick paper cut through the persistent hum of the basement ventilation system. I slid one document across the chipped laminate table to Jamal, one to Kiara, and the last one to Andre. They looked down at the cover pages. The crisp black embossed logo at the center read Obsidian Apex Advisory. Below the logo was the official designation of a fully licensed, federally approved, independent, registered investment advisor firm. It was an entity entirely free from the parasitic grip of regional vice presidents and the suffocating bureaucracy of legacy wirehouses. I watched their eyes scan the first page, absorbing the heavy legal text. I told them this was not a conceptual pitch or a distant corporate dream. This was a fully operational, legally registered fiduciary entity. I explained that I had spent the last 3 months liquidating my own personal stock options and leveraging my own capital to build our new home. I had secured a stunning private office space in a glass high-rise in Buckhead. I had partnered with one of the most elite custodial banks in the country to physically hold our assets and execute our trades. The technological infrastructure was already installed, tested, and waiting for them to log in. Jamal immediately flipped past the executive summary and went straight to the compensation structure. He was a numbers man, and I knew exactly what he needed to see. I told him to read the figures out loud. I had matched their current corporate base salaries down to the exact dollar, ensuring that none of them would face a single disruption in their personal financial security. They would not have to worry about mortgage payments or student loans while we navigated the transition. But the corporate bonus structure was entirely different. Upstairs, Roland routinely manipulated the arbitrary regional metrics to slash our division's bonuses, funneling those diverted funds into his own executive compensation packages. That theft ended today. I doubled their performance bonuses. I explained that without the bloated corporate overhead subsidizing country club memberships, luxury box seats, and incompetent nepotism hires, the revenue generated by our flawless market execution would flow directly back to the people actually doing the work. But salary and bonuses were just the floor. That was how you treated employees, and I was not looking to hire employees. I instructed Kiara to turn to page 4 of her document. There, outlined in irrefutable, ironclad legal terminology, was the equity distribution schedule. I was offering them ownership. They were receiving significant, fully vested equity stakes in Obsidian Apex Advisory. They were no longer disposable analysts who could be banished to a sub-basement on the whim of a fragile executive. They were founding partners of a boutique wealth management firm. Kiara traced her finger over the bold text designating her new title: Chief Risk Officer. The profound trauma of the morning, the crushing humiliation of being escorted down the freight elevator by security guards, completely evaporated from her face. It was replaced by a fierce, undeniable pride. She sat up straighter, her spine aligning perfectly as the reality of her new executive status settled over her. Jamal stared at his own document, his eyes locked on his designation as head of predictive analytics. The brilliant mathematician from Southwest Atlanta suddenly realized he was no longer just running the numbers for the casino. He officially owned a piece of the house. Andre smiled a slow, deeply satisfied smile as he read his title as Director of Client Strategy. The man who had spent years soothing the anxieties of demanding billionaires now had his name legally attached to the firm that would protect their wealth. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cheap desk. I told them I did not build our $800 million portfolio alone, and I absolutely refused to own the next chapter alone. The corporate establishment had shown us exactly what they thought of young, brilliant Black professionals. They demanded our relentless labor. They profited immensely from our flawless execution, but they would always deny us the throne. Whenever we climbed too high, they would simply change the locks and hand the keys to someone like Trent. So we were going to stop asking for a seat at their mahogany table. We had built our own table, and we owned the entire room. The silence in the basement felt entirely different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of defeat. It was the charged electric silence of an ambush being perfectly primed. The stark contrast between the flickering fluorescent lights above us and the heavy, expensive legal paper in front of us highlighted the sheer, beautiful audacity of what we were doing. We were plotting a multi-million-dollar breakaway right beneath the feet of the men who thought they had buried us. I explained the precise mechanics of our extraction. I detailed how my transition attorney had bulletproofed these employment contracts against the firm's aggressive, non-solicit agreements. Because our current employer was a signatory of the Protocol for Broker Recruiting, we possessed a very narrow, highly regulated legal pathway to transition our book of business. As long as we followed the exact legal protocol, taking no proprietary client data, downloading no internal firm documents, and operating with absolute airtight secrecy, Roland could not touch us. We just needed to execute the transfer mechanically and flawlessly. They did not need the 48 hours I had initially asked for. Jamal reached into his jacket, pulled out a silver pen, and flipped directly to the signature page. He signed his name with a sharp, aggressive flourish, the ink binding him to his new empire. Kiara took the pen next. Her signature was no longer the jagged, terrified mess of ink that Roland had forced her to scribble on that fraudulent performance document upstairs. Her signature was a bold, confident stroke of absolute defiance. Andre signed his name last, closed the heavy leather-bound folder, and looked up at me with eyes that were utterly fearless. The psychological transition from corporate employees to independent owners was officially complete. They were no longer operating under the fear of termination. They were operating with the cold, lethal focus of competitors preparing to dismantle a rival. We had the legal framework, we had the equity, and we had the burning desire to make Roland pay for his disrespect. Now we had to execute the greatest financial heist this firm had ever seen, and we had to do it completely in the dark. The heavy leather-bound folders disappeared back into my briefcase, carrying the signed declarations of our independence. As the metallic click of the briefcase lock echoed in the concrete room, the true strategic brilliance of our new operational environment became undeniable. Up on the 40th floor, we were subjected to a relentless panopticon of corporate surveillance. Administrative assistants constantly walked past our glass partitions. Junior brokers eager to curry favor with regional vice presidents monitored our coffee break conversations. Roland himself possessed a direct line of sight to our monitor screens from his corner office. In that environment, orchestrating a mass division extraction would have required exhausting subterfuge and constant paranoia. By banishing us to the sub-basement, Roland had inadvertently handed us the ultimate tactical advantage. He had completely severed the visual and administrative oversight that protected his empire. Down here, surrounded by rattling pipes and peeling linoleum, we were invisible. The heavy metal freight doors shielded us from the daily foot traffic of the firm. No one was going to casually stroll into a damp storage closet to check on the disgraced wealth management team. Roland's greatest weapon, his desire to humiliate us visually, had instantly become his fatal flaw. We were operating entirely in the dark, and that was exactly where I needed my strike team to be. We immediately shifted our operational focus from maintaining the firm's portfolios to orchestrating our legal extraction. Breaking away under the Protocol for Broker Recruiting is a high-stakes tightrope walk. The legal framework dictates exactly what information an exiting advisor is permitted to take. We were legally allowed to retain 5 specific pieces of client data: client name, address, phone number, email, and account title. Taking anything else, a single printed performance report, a downloaded financial plan, or an exported proprietary database, would instantly trigger a breach of contract lawsuit and a federal injunction. Roland would jump at the chance to freeze our transition in court. But Roland fundamentally misunderstood the nature of our client relationships. He thought the firm owned the clients because the firm owned the servers. What he failed to realize was that my team did not need a corporate database to know our clients. We had built these relationships from the ground up. Andre did not need to search a customer relationship management software to find Evelyn Sterling's direct cell phone number. He knew it by heart. Kiara did not need to export the Montgomery family trust documents to understand the complex tax shielding. She had built the architecture from scratch and carried the blueprints in her head. Instead of triggering the firm's cybersecurity alarms by downloading digital files, we went analog. For the next 2 days, we sat under those buzzing fluorescent lights and wrote out our client contact lists entirely by hand. We utilized cheap yellow legal pads and basic ballpoint pens, manually extracting $800 million worth of relational equity directly from our own memories. We were quietly transferring the firm's most valuable assets onto lined paper, completely bypassing their multi-million-dollar digital firewall. While we meticulously documented our exit strategy, the illusion of our submission was constantly reinforced from above. Trent, emboldened by his new executive suite, sent a patronizing firm-wide email demanding that our team finalize his new quarterly projections by Friday afternoon. The email was drenched in unearned authority, instructing us to ensure the formatting was clean enough for his upcoming client presentations. I replied with a perfectly compliant, respectfully brief message assuring our Senior Vice President of Strategy that the reports would be delivered right on schedule. Andre then generated a series of sanitized, utterly meaningless spreadsheets filled with generic market data and impressive-sounding buzzwords. We fed Trent this steady stream of busywork to keep him completely sedated. Trent was so intoxicated by the illusion of commanding us that he never bothered to verify the substance of the work. He was playing a corporate simulation while we were actively disassembling his reality. Jamal recalibrated his immense analytical focus. Instead of forecasting technology sector volatility, he spent his hours mapping out the automated account transfer systems we would need the moment our independent firm went live. He carefully drafted the timeline for the automated customer account transfer service forms. He ensured that the second our clients authorized the move, the routing numbers to our new elite custodian bank would execute flawlessly, draining the firm's capital reserves before Roland could even comprehend the hemorrhage. Kiara applied her terrifying brilliance to auditing our new firm's compliance structure. She ran mock regulatory scenarios, bulletproofing our independent operation, to guarantee that when the Securities and Exchange Commission reviewed our incoming transfers, they would find an airtight, legally unassailable fiduciary entity. She worked with a fierce, quiet intensity, channeling the humiliation of Roland's forced disciplinary signature into building a fortress where no incompetent executive could ever threaten her licenses again. The physical toll of the basement was undeniable, but the psychological high of our impending strike completely overrode the discomfort. We survived on lukewarm black coffee from a vending machine down the hall and stale protein bars, but nobody complained about the damp chill in the air. The erratic strobe effect of the failing light bulb above us no longer felt like a symbol of banishment. The rhythmic vibration of the building's massive heating and cooling system became the steady heartbeat of our liberation. We were executing a highly complex financial heist right under the noses of the corporate guards. As Thursday afternoon bled into Friday morning, the clock ticked down to our final operational window. I opened my briefcase one last time and extracted 4 crisp, pristine white envelopes. Inside each envelope was a standardized, legally vetted letter of immediate resignation. I laid them out on the chipped laminate table, handing one to Jamal, one to Kiara, and one to Andre. We finalized the exact choreography of our departure. We mapped out how we would leave the building, the precise moment we would drop the envelopes on the human resources desk, and the immediate coordinated race to initiate our off-site client meetings. We had survived the isolation. We had utilized the darkness to secure our legal framework, organize our transfer logistics, and prepare the definitive end of Roland's empire. The quiet efficiency of our sub-basement operation was complete. It was time to leave the shadows and bring the fire directly to the clients who trusted us with their generational wealth. At exactly 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, we executed the departure. We left the sub-basement, walked directly to the 39th floor, and placed our 4 crisp white envelopes on the human resources reception desk. We did not wait for David or his predictable bureaucratic questions. We did not offer exit interviews. We simply turned around, stepped into the elevator, and walked out the glass front doors of the building into the warm Atlanta air. We were no longer employees of a toxic corporate machine. We were independent fiduciaries, and we had a meticulously planned schedule to keep. My first meeting was set for 4:30. I drove straight to a private, heavily guarded residential community in Buckhead. Evelyn Sterling was waiting for me in the sunroom of her estate. She had prepared iced tea, expecting a standard portfolio update. She immediately noted that Trent was absent, a fact I addressed without hesitation. I sat across from the logistics magnate, unlocked my leather briefcase, and pulled out a single secured tablet. I did not soften the blow. I respect my clients far too much to feed them corporate platitudes or PR spin. I looked Evelyn directly in the eye and told her that the firm she had trusted with her $40 million portfolio had completely compromised her financial security to protect an unqualified nepotism hire. I opened the encrypted files on the tablet. I showed Evelyn the unedited server logs translating the dense alphanumeric code into plain, undeniable facts. I explained that Trent had failed his licensing exams and was legally barred from executing trades, yet Roland had granted him unfettered access to her accounts to inflate his own family's prestige. I showed her the falsified digital signatures and the timeline of the cover-up. Evelyn was a woman who had built a massive shipping empire in a male-dominated industry during the 1970s. She did not panic. Her eyes simply hardened into chips of pure ice. She recognized corporate arrogance and profound disrespect when she saw it. She asked me exactly what Roland had done to my team after the breach. I told her he had banished us to a windowless basement to hide his fraud and silence our oversight. Evelyn set down her glass of iced tea. She did not ask to speak to Roland. She did not ask for a meeting with the firm's compliance board. She looked at me and asked where she needed to sign to move her money to my new firm. I slid the automated customer account transfer service agreement across the glass table. The ACAT form is the absolute most powerful weapon in the financial transition arsenal. The moment it is signed and processed by a receiving institution, the relinquishing firm is legally mandated to transfer the assets within a strict federal timeline. They cannot block it. They cannot delay it. They cannot hold the funds hostage. Evelyn signed her name with a heavy gold pen, transferring $40 million to Obsidian Apex Advisory in a matter of seconds. My next meeting took place at a private dining club in Midtown. Dr. Harrison Caldwell and the patriarch of the Montgomery Family Trust were waiting for me in a reserved, soundproof room. This was the critical strike. The Montgomery Trust was the exact account Trent had actively attempted to destroy. When I sat down with the two men, I bypassed all small talk. I projected the raw trade data from my encrypted drive directly onto the room's secure display screen. I walked the Montgomery patriarch through the exact timeline of that disastrous Tuesday afternoon. I showed him the precise moment Trent bypassed the digital firewall Kiara had built. I showed him the phone logs detailing Trent's unauthorized verbal command to the New York execution desk. I broke down the exact mathematical reality of the short-term and long-term capital gains tax liability that Trent had temporarily generated before I intercepted the reporting sequence. I explained that Roland, a regional vice president acting as a supervising principal, had deliberately falsified federal records to frame a brilliant, innocent black woman for his brother-in-law's catastrophic incompetence. The reaction was visceral. The Montgomery patriarch was a man who valued absolute precision and unbreakable trust. He stared at the screen, his face flushing with a deep, quiet rage. He realized that the legacy tech stocks his grandfather had purchased had been treated like casino chips by a man playing executive dress-up. Dr. Caldwell, a surgeon who understood that gross negligence in any field is completely unforgivable, was equally disgusted. He looked at me and asked how long I had been protecting their assets from the firm's upper management. I told him I had been acting as a human shield for 8 years, but that shield was no longer sustainable in a corrupt environment. I told them I had built my own fortress. I presented the onboarding documents for Obsidian Apex Advisory. I explained the rigorous compliance protocols Kiara had instituted, the elite-tier custodial bank, holding the assets and the absolute autonomy my team now possessed. I assured them that in my firm, there were no legacy hires. There were no country club promotions. There was only raw data mathematical discipline and unshakable fiduciary duty. The Montgomery patriarch reached for the transfer documents. He did not hesitate. He signed the automated transfer forms, legally binding over $100 million to move with me. Dr. Caldwell signed immediately after, adding another substantial layer to our initial capital base. By 8 o'clock on Friday evening, I had navigated back-to-back meetings and secured signatures from my top 15 highest net worth clients. Not a single one chose to stay with Roland. The loyalty I had cultivated over 8 years of relentless, flawless execution completely eclipsed the artificial prestige of the corporate logo on the building. They knew that I was the actual architect of their wealth. The firm was just the landlord, and the landlord had proven to be deeply corrupt. I drove back to my new, pristine office space in Buckhead. Jamal, Kiara, and Andre were waiting in our glass-enclosed conference room, overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline. I walked in and placed the thick stack of signed ACAT forms on the center of the table. Andre immediately began processing the documents, feeding the transfer requests into the secure portal of our new custodial bank. Kiara initiated the compliance locks, sealing our new clients into our protected ecosystem and ensuring the regulatory transition was flawless. Jamal set the execution triggers for Monday morning. The digital commands were queued up in the banking servers, waiting silently over the weekend. Roland and Trent were currently heading into their weekends entirely oblivious to the fact that their empire had been completely hollowed out. They thought they had secured their high-level portfolios by locking my team in a basement and forcing a signature on a fake performance plan. They had no idea that we had just spent Friday evening legally detaching $800 million from their general ledger. The trap was fully loaded, the evidence of their felonies was secured, and the countdown to Monday morning had officially begun. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, brilliant clarity of a flawlessly executed strategy. I did not drive to the downtown corporate headquarters. I did not step onto the freight elevator to descend into a windowless concrete bunker. Instead, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new Buckhead office, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the Atlanta traffic flow beneath me. Jamal, Kiara, and Andre were already stationed at their new dual-monitor trading desks. The atmosphere in Obsidian Apex Advisory was electric. We were waiting for the opening bell. 10 miles away on the 40th floor of my former firm, Roland and Trent were stepping off the executive elevator. I could perfectly visualize the scene. Roland would be wearing one of his bespoke suits, exuding the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had successfully crushed a rebellion. Trent would likely be holding an artisanal iced coffee, strolling into my former corner office to admire the mahogany desk he had stolen. They believed my team was currently sitting in the damp sub-basement, thoroughly humiliated and working in silent submission. They expected to spend the morning reviewing the sanitized, meaningless spreadsheets Andre had left behind. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, the stock market officially opened, and at exactly 9:30 and 1 second, the automated custodial servers executed our transfer commands. Up in the penthouse suite, Roland sat down at his terminal and logged into the regional master ledger. He intended to check the daily balances of his newly acquired high-net-worth portfolios. Instead of the usual green metrics indicating steady growth, his entire monitor screen instantly flashed a blinding, catastrophic red. A severe compliance alert popped up on his display, accompanied by a sharp, digitized warning tone. Then another alert appeared, then 10 more, then 50. The automated customer account transfer service protocols were hitting the firm's central servers with the force of a financial tsunami. Because the system is federally mandated to protect client autonomy, the relinquishing firm has absolutely no power to halt or delay the process once the receiving custodian initiates the pull. The digital gates were blown wide open. Roland watched in absolute paralyzed horror as Evelyn Sterling's $40 million account balance dropped to zero. A notification appeared stating the assets were currently in transit to an external independent registered investment advisor. Before he could even process the loss of his most prestigious client, the screen flashed again. Dr. Caldwell's massive municipal bond ladders vanished from the system. The Montgomery Family Trust, the crown jewel of the entire regional branch, evaporated into thin air, taking over $100 million with it. Account after account, portfolio after portfolio, the numbers aggressively flatlined. The red alerts cascaded down Roland's monitor in a relentless, unforgiving waterfall of digital extraction. Trent, hearing the commotion, rushed out of the corner office. His own terminal was mirroring the exact same catastrophic failure. The $150 million starter portfolio he had bragged about all weekend was completely gone. Roland grabbed his desk phone, his hands shaking so violently he misdialed the internal extension twice. He finally reached the central execution desk in New York, demanding they freeze the outgoing transfers. The broker on the other end of the line delivered the cold, legal reality. The clients had submitted legally binding, digitally verified signatures authorizing the total migration of their wealth. The firm possessed no legal standing to interfere. Desperate and unraveling, Roland slammed the phone down and sprinted out to the reception desk. He ordered his terrified executive assistant to go down to the sub-basement immediately and physically retrieve my team. He needed me in his office to stop the bleeding. He still operated under the delusion that I was his subordinate, a pawn he could command to fix the catastrophe. The assistant hurried to the freight elevator, rode it down to the lowest level, and pushed open the heavy metal doors. She stepped into the dim, buzzing storage room, but there was no one sitting at the chipped laminate tables. The room was entirely silent save for the rattling pipes overhead. The only items left in the bunker were 4 pristine white envelopes containing our immediate resignation letters. Resting neatly on top of each envelope was a corporate security badge and an executive access card. Back on the 40th floor, the financial hemorrhage reached its terrifying conclusion. Over $800 million in assets under management had been successfully legally stripped from the firm's ledger in less than 10 minutes. The revenue stream that funded the entire regional branch, the capital that paid for Roland's luxury box seats and Trent's outrageous salary, was entirely paralyzed. The empire Roland thought he had conquered was now nothing more than an empty, worthless shell. My personal cell phone began to vibrate on the sleek glass surface of my new conference table. The caller identification displayed a restricted corporate number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the absolute desperation vibrating through the device. I looked up at Jamal, Kiara, and Andre. The triumphant energy in the room quieted, replaced by a razor-sharp anticipation. I picked up the phone, pressed the speaker button, and set it back down in the center of the table. "Gabrielle!" Roland's voice echoed through my office. He was not using his polished country club baritone. He was screaming. The sound was ragged, breathless, and completely unhinged. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Roland demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "I have security running through the building right now. You are in direct violation of your non-solicit agreement. You are breaching your employment contract. I am going to have the firm's legal department freeze your assets. I am going to sue you into absolute bankruptcy, and I will personally see to it that you are permanently disbarred from the financial industry." I leaned back in my chair. Kiara crossed her arms, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spreading across her face. Jamal shook his head, listening to the meltdown of a man who had thought he was untouchable just an hour ago. "Are you finished, Roland?" I asked. My voice was a perfectly flat, icy sheet of glass. The sheer calm in my tone made the frantic energy on his end of the line sound even more pathetic. "You stole $800 million from this firm," he yelled, completely ignoring my question. "You are going to reverse those automated customer account transfer requests right now, or I am calling the federal authorities." "You fundamentally misunderstand how wealth management works, Roland," I replied, articulating every word with lethal precision. "I did not steal a single dime. Clients have the absolute legal right to choose their fiduciaries. I adhered strictly to the protocol for broker recruiting. I took no proprietary data, I downloaded no internal files, and I took no corporate property. The clients simply realized they were parking their generational wealth in a burning building, and they decided to walk out the front door." I could hear Trent in the background on Roland's end, his voice high-pitched and frantic, asking what was happening. Roland ignored him, breathing heavily into the receiver. "You framed my best analyst," I continued, seamlessly shifting from defense to offense. The temperature in my office seemed to drop as I delivered the facts. "You took a catastrophic, unauthorized block trade executed by your unlicensed, incompetent brother-in-law, and you maliciously altered federal financial records to make it look like Kiara committed a regulatory violation. You placed her on a performance improvement plan to cover your own tracks." "I have no idea what you are talking about," Roland stammered, attempting to maintain his lie even as his empire collapsed. "The system logs show exactly who made that trade. Kiara signed the disciplinary paperwork. She signed a meaningless piece of paper because I told her to," I countered. "I needed you to feel secure. I needed you to look away so I could access the deep back-end server logs. I used my legacy executive administrative clearance to pull the raw data packets. I have the exact internet protocol routing data proving Trent initiated the trade from his terminal. I have the audio transcript logs from his call to the New York execution desk. And most importantly, Roland, I have the exact keystroke sequences proving you utilized your supervisory override to manually erase his temporary identification number and inject Kiara's credentials into the daily ledger." Dead silence fell over the speakerphone. The aggressive blustering completely stopped. I could practically hear the blood draining from his face. "You committed a felony under the Securities Exchange Act," I stated, letting the reality of his crime hang in the air. "And you did it to protect a man who could not pass a basic licensing exam." "Gabrielle, please," Roland whispered. The threat of lawsuits vanished entirely instantly, replaced by raw, naked begging. "We can fix this. You do not need to take this outside the region. We can adjust the records. I can authorize a massive compensation package for your team. Just do not escalate this." "I already did," I replied, delivering the final fatal blow. At exactly 9:30 this morning, an automated, heavily encrypted email was dispatched from my server. It contained the raw data logs, the internet protocol addresses, and the unedited trade blotters. It was sent simultaneously to the firm's global chief compliance officer, the executive board in New York, and the enforcement division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. A sharp strangling sound came from the other end of the line. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire life was over. "Do not ever contact me or my team again," I said. I reached out and pressed the end call button. The line went dead, severing our connection to the corporate parasite forever. I looked up at Jamal, Kiara, and Andre. We did not cheer. We did not gloat. We simply shared a look of profound, unbreakable solidarity. The war was officially over, and we had won. The corporate board in New York did not hesitate. The moment my encrypted file landed in their inboxes, they enacted a ruthless, immediate emergency audit. By Tuesday morning, a team of external forensic accountants and federal compliance officers swarmed the 40th floor, locking down every terminal and seizing the physical servers. Roland was escorted out of the building by corporate security in full view of the entire regional branch. His career was completely incinerated. He was terminated immediately for gross misconduct. His unvested stock options were entirely revoked, and his reputation in the financial sector was permanently destroyed. Trent did not fare any better. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched a formal, aggressive investigation into his unauthorized trading and the subsequent administrative cover-up. He was permanently stripped of his minimal credentials and legally barred from ever operating in the wealth management industry again. Furthermore, he was slapped with crippling federal fines that no country club connection could pay off. Without his brother-in-law to protect him, the golden boy collapsed completely under the weight of his own profound incompetence. Their toxic alliance was dismantled by the very digital evidence they thought they had so cleverly buried. Back in Buckhead, the atmosphere was entirely different. The late afternoon sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of Obsidian Apex Advisory, casting a warm golden glow over the immaculate trading floor we now owned outright. I stood at the head of our sleek custom conference table, holding a crystal flute filled with chilled champagne. Jamal, Kiara, and Andre stood beside me, their glasses raised. The heavy exhaustion of the past few weeks had completely vanished, replaced by a fierce, undeniable pride in the thrilling reality of total autonomy. We clinked our glasses together, the clear, sharp sound ringing beautifully through our own empire. I looked at the brilliant, dedicated professionals standing in front of me, taking in the profound magnitude of what we had just accomplished. We had refused to be victims of a systemic hierarchy designed to keep us subdued and subservient. I raised my glass one final time, locking eyes with the team that had trusted me with their livelihoods. When toxic people try to bury you in the basement, they just give you the darkness you need to develop the film. They rely on manipulation and intimidation because they lack the actual competence to compete on an even playing field. Never accept a seat at a table where your brilliance is actively disrespected and your hard work is stolen to subsidize someone else's mediocrity. You take your talent, you walk out the door, and you build your own empire. Let their fragile egos collapse under their own weight. We operate in the light now, and we own the entire room. True power is derived from unassailable competence, not fabricated corporate titles. When trapped in a toxic environment that actively devalues your worth and rewards nepotism, never accept defeat or compromise your integrity. Instead, use their arrogance and underestimation as your greatest strategic advantage. Quietly build your own foundation, rely on the undeniable brilliance of your team, and meticulously plan your independence. True professionals own the fruits of their labor and their client relationships. Eventually, manufactured authority collapses under the weight of its own incompetence. Success belongs to those who possess the courage to control their own destiny. Stop settling for a seat at a broken table. Take control of your career today and start building an empire of your own.